Hogwarts, starting with the Unforgivable Curses at max level. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination, so don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like, and if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 26: Hermione's Secret Competition. Dylan spent almost all of his weekend in the library, except for eating and sleeping. He'd only just managed to finish reading the precise formula for a high-level potion. Luckily, he didn't need to go to Professor Snape to brew a potion right away. There was still a week until the next weekend, plenty of time for him to finish reading the Safe Use Guide for Potions. His priority now was to further consolidate his knowledge of advanced potions, lest he make any basic mistakes in front of Professor Snape. Another half-week flew by. Thursday. Dylan woke up early again. To his surprise, Harry and Ron also sat up. The other two were still sound asleep. "Hey, good morning," Ron stretched. Dylan had already thrown back the covers and gotten out of bed. As he packed his bag, he asked Harry and Ron in surprise, "Why are you up so early today?" "Of course, it's because I have flying lessons today. I didn't get much sleep all night." Ron jumped out of bed. Flying lessons? Dylan did remember that there was flying class today, a new one only added in the second week of school. But what was so exciting about it? It must be nice to be able to fly freely in the sky, Ron chuckled. "My brothers always describe it to me like that." Harry got out of bed as well. "Once I learned flying lessons, I can sign up for Quidditch." "Quidditch, not interesting. Instead of crashing into others in the sky like a flying bull, I'd rather read a few more books." Dylan had long lost interest in bumper cars. Of course, they should probably be called bumper brooms. "Dylan, have you learned about flying spells? You've learned how to fly by now, right?" Harry blinked at him. Dylan shook his head and corrected him. "There's no such thing as a flying spell. To fly, you usually need magical tools and a levitation charm. Once you use the levitation charm to make your broom fly, you can control its direction, and your speed will naturally depend on the quality of your broom. This, in fact, shows that spells can be combined with magical tools. Just as wizards can channel magic through their wands or amplify its effects, the crafting of a magic broomstick inevitably involves the use of numerous magical materials. Crafted through a complex process, it inevitably interacts with the spell being cast, amplifying the spell's effectiveness. This is why high-quality magic broomsticks fly faster and more nimbly than others. When it comes to flying, it's best to have an adult over to watch over you. Trying on your own can lead to unexpected dangers. Dylan admitted he had never practiced flying at home. "Oh my God, there's something you can't do, Dylan?" Ron asked in amazement. If I practiced flying at home, and someone saw me, wouldn't the Ministry of Magic arrest me?" Ron blinked, realizing what was happening. After all, he was a pure-blood wizard, while Dylan was different. He was a muggle. The wizarding world had strict laws prohibiting the use of magic in the muggle world. Harry walked over to his backpack. "I've heard a lot of my classmates say in class these past couple of days that they've practiced flying at home." Just then, Seamus woke up. Hearing Harry's words, he scrambled to his feet. "I also heard someone, led by their parents, flew over the giant mountains on a broomstick." Ron rolled his eyes. "It must be that boastful Malfoy again. The giant mountains? The environment over there is harsh. No one would fly there, right?" Dylan smiled. "The most important thing is, even purebloods, parents usually don't let their children practice flying on a broomstick before school starts." Dylan looked at Ron. "Your parents don't allow you to practice before school starts, do they?" Ron nodded repeatedly. "Yes, George tried to teach me once, but my mom found out and he got a good spanking." Seamus was stunned. "Really? Are they just bragging?" Dylan shrugged. "Perhaps. Young wizards have strong pride and a strong competitive spirit. It's normal to tell a few lies and brag in front of classmates." After packing his backpack, Dylan took out the notes Professor McGonagall had compiled for him, holding them in his hands, and planned to read them on the way. As for the levitation charm, he hadn't yet experienced true flight, so he wasn't at the highest level, but he was already at level 7. Regardless, he had mastered several spells at the highest level. Even if those spells were dark arts, sometimes many magical arts shared commonalities. Drawing lines with dots paved the way for the future. For Dylan, learning magic wasn't that difficult. Not to mention that the achievement system had significantly increased his magical talent. Since almost everyone in the dormitory was awake, Ron ran to Neville and shook him awake. "Wake up, don't sleep anymore, let's go eat." "Huh? What?" Neville was still dazed. "Stop being hysterical and get up." At Ron's insistence, Neville got up. He was honest and didn't seem grumpy at all. The group quickly packed up and, for the first time, walked out of the dormitories together into the Great Hall. "This is the first time we've all had breakfast together," Ron said. "Dylan always wakes up too early. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't wake up." Harry found a relatively empty seat and sat down. Dylan smiled and followed suit, saying nothing. Not long after, Hermione entered the Great Hall. Seeing them gathered there, she approached. For a while, because Dylan had excelled in his magic exercises in almost every class, earning Gryffindor points, Hermione had been secretly competing with him. But over time, she realized that Dylan seemed to have no need for entertainment at all. He was studying almost every moment, and his knowledge was far beyond her reach. Worst of all, the professor's questions to him were of a completely different level of difficulty than her own. Hermione tried to answer the professor's questions to Dylan, but the result was predictable. So after several consecutive setbacks, Hermione's mentality changed slightly. She no longer tried to compete with Dylan in class, but instead quietly observed Dylan. Chapter 27 Good news, the license has been approved. Bad news. As the saying goes, know thy enemy, know thyself, and you can fight 100 battles without defeat. Hermione wondered if she could emulate Dylan's approach to studying. Would she be able to communicate with a professor like Dylan? After some follow-up research, she discovered Dylan was truly completely immersed in his studies. One morning, she tried to stake out Dylan to see what time he woke up. She waited until class started, but he didn't. In the end, she was almost late. This meant Dylan must have gotten up even earlier than her. This discovery shocked Hermione. She had been up at 6:30 to stake out Dylan. If she hadn't even spotted him, what time did he get up? He couldn't have been studying all night. Did he even need sleep? The next day, Hermione tried waking up at 6 o'clock, but still couldn't spot him. Until she forced her time to 5 o'clock. Dragging her groggy body into the common room, she finally spotted Dylan. This discovery also made Hermione completely lose the idea of arguing with Dylan to the end. If she continued to argue, her life would be over first. She had thought that she was very diligent to get up at 6:30, at least at this time, the people around her were still asleep. She didn't expect that she was superficial. After calming down, Hermione discovered that Dylan's attitude towards magic was not the same as the possibility of him getting anxious because he couldn't learn a more complicated spell. Unlike her, if she couldn't finish her homework or read some difficult-to-understand parts, she would be very anxious. He was always so calm and stable. Sometimes she really wondered if the sorting hat had sorted Dylan into the wrong house. "Hermione, good morning." Harry looked at Hermione, his eyes widening. "You look much better than the last 2 days." Ron looked over and nodded in agreement. "Right. What were you doing the other day? You have such dark circles under your eyes." Hermione walked over and sat down beside the others. "Nothing. Just moved to a new place and couldn't sleep well tonight." Ever since she stopped getting up early to follow Dylan, she'd felt much better. She'd even gotten a good night's sleep last night. How could she not look good? "We have flying class today. Are you ready?" Hermione glanced at the others. To better follow Dylan, she'd deliberately gotten closer to Harry and the others, hoping to build relationships with Dylan's roommates and get some information about their studies. This had led to her becoming close friends with several of Dylan's roommates, especially Ron and Harry. The three of them had become close friends, and she'd occasionally tease Dylan from behind. "A little nervous. I'm just afraid of embarrassing myself," Harry answered honestly. Dylan was a bit surprised, holding up a small piece of bread in his right hand. "Embarrassing? That shouldn't be a big deal, right? We're all beginners in magic. It's normal to not learn well at first. Just practice and you'll be fine." Harry and the others twitched their lips and looked at Dylan. Anyone could say that, except you. They were beginners, sure, but what about you? With all those fancy, advanced spells you demonstrated in class, could you still be considered a beginner? Hermione took the glass of milk from her and pulled out a copy of a Quidditch Battles, beginning to peruse it. "I heard flying is tricky and easy to embarrass yourself. If I don't learn it well, the professor won't give me a high grade in this class." Dylan glanced at her. "From what I understand, although there's a required flying class at the end of our first year exam, it only tests our flying form. You just need to control the broom and perform some simple maneuvers. You won't get a low grade just because of your performance in your first class." Hermione nodded slightly, but she was still flipping through the book, trying to figure out some flying techniques she could master in Quidditch. Dylan shrugged. Hermione, though bright and hard-working, was overly obsessed with perfection, memorizing every single point of knowledge and striving for flawlessness. However, after Dylan mastered several max-level spells, he realized that while some magic was just about knowing how to use it, others required perfection. Take flying lessons for example. If someone can use apparition continuously, what's the difference between that and being able to fly? Absolutely not. So, among the vast sea of spells, the effects of some spells will be covered by other spells. Instead of holding everything in your hands, it's better to loosen some and hold on to others. Hualala. Just as Dylan was about to drink some sea cucumber soup, a large flock of owls suddenly flew in outside the auditorium. At the same time, a white shadow fluttered over and landed at Dylan's desk. "Luna." Dylan was stunned. Looking at the snow-white owl in front of him, he noticed the letter tied to Luna's feet. Could it be a letter from my parents? But why are there two letters? It can't be that his parents each wrote a letter. Is there something this old couple has to say to their son that they don't want others to know? Dylan took the envelope off Luna's feet. Hermione and Harry leaned over, but not directly at the letter in Dylan's hand. Instead, they looked at the gleaming silver card tucked inside. "Wow. What's this?" Ron asked curiously. Dylan, unsure, pulled it out and took a look. He realized it was a permit. A permit to keep a raven. Dylan's heart leaped with joy. He glanced at the contents of the letters. One was from the Magical Creatures Authority, essentially stating that he was licensed to keep a raven. Strangely, he noticed that the person recommending him wasn't Hagrid, but Dumbledore. Curious, he opened the other letter. This one was from Hagrid, explaining that Hagrid had offered to write a letter of recommendation. However, due to a difficult situation Hagrid faced, he sought Professor Dumbledore's help to avoid upsetting him. The letter also stated that if he had time, he could thank Professor Dumbledore for his help. Dylan's joy was instantly shattered, and he felt a moment of frustration. "No, Brother Hagrid, if you can't help, you don't have to agree so quickly. Let him go to Dumbledore and thank him in person? It's not impossible. It's just, if you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 28. Can this broom make me fly? If I'm alone with Dumbledore, won't he notice anything? Dylan pondered, putting the envelope away. For the first 2 weeks of school, he'd been running around the professor's offices daily, but no one had noticed he'd mastered the 6 dark arts. Dylan suspected this was due to his achievement rewards. He'd previously completed 2 achievements. One prevented others from indirectly tracking his magical traces. The other allowed him to cast dark magic regardless of negative emotions, which obviously included the 3 unforgivable curses. This allowed him to cast Avada Kedavra with a smile. Because he was devoid of negative emotions, even those who suspected he had mastered the dark arts would doubt themselves first. After all, how could someone without even a hint of negative emotion possibly master the full dark arts? To everyone, Dylan was a diligent, studious, and positive child. This was the impression Dylan had of him from nearly every professor he met. Naturally, no one questioned his mastery of the dark arts, which had emboldened him recently, less fearful than at first. However, other professors were different, and Dumbledore was Dumbledore. He hadn't yet had any one-on-one contact with Dumbledore. He wasn't sure if this legendary wizard, living in close proximity, would notice anything. Never mind, I don't think Dumbledore needs my personal thanks, do I? To be on the safe side, Dylan decided to minimize contact with Dumbledore, avoiding any one-on-one time with him. He was such an old man, still here, and still busy, battling old Fusey, caring for a bunch of troublesome kids, and even considering salary increases for his teachers. How could he continue to disturb his peace? Dylan decided that, to lead the charge in promoting kindness towards the elderly, he would focus his energy and time on his own learning. I still have a chapter left to read in potions today, and I need to study divination too. Besides, I just recently read about the similarities between transfiguration and summoning spells, so I need to get through that soon. Dylan felt like there were too many books waiting for him to indulge. He couldn't satisfy them if he didn't make an effort. Just then, Neville suddenly cried out. Dylan's thoughts were interrupted, and he turned to look. Neville was holding a glowing red remembrance ball in his hand. Dylan raised an eyebrow. The red color of the remembrance ball indicated that Neville had forgotten something important. However, looking at Neville's distressed frown, Dylan knew that even with the remembrance ball's reminder, he wouldn't be able to remember what he had forgotten. "Who gave you this remembrance ball?" Ron asked from the side. "My grandmother sent it to me." Neville held the remembrance ball in one hand. He gently rubbed his chubby cheek with one hand, his brow furrowed slightly, his eyes narrowed into slits, and his head tilted back slightly, searching his mind. "But what exactly did I forget?" Dylan saw his face flush, pursed his lips, took the memory ball from Neville's hand, and stuffed it into his school bag. "Okay, Neville, if it's something you can't remember, then it can't be important. If it was important, you'd remember it when you really encountered it." Neville blinked. "Well, what if something happened and I didn't prepare anything in advance? How do you know you'll encounter something that requires you to prepare in advance?" Dylan asked. "You forgot it anyway, didn't you?" Greek letter upsilon. Neville's expression was slightly dull. Dylan patted his shoulder and pressed a glass of milk into his hand. "I'm familiar with every professor's assignment. I don't think there's anything more important than this." Neville raised his round face and nodded in agreement. "That makes sense." He quickly put the matter behind him and quickly began to eat breakfast. After lunch, the group rose to prepare for class. As Dylan sat down in the front row, a vague thought suddenly struck him. Wait, Neville forgot something. Could it be? Before he could wrap his mind around it, the professor walked in. Dylan immediately fell into study mode. After class, he chased the professor around, asking his usual questions. Then came the afternoon flying class. Dylan and Harry went to the open space in front of the castle gates. The young Slytherin wizards had gathered there. Dylan looked ahead and saw nearly 30 broomsticks, arranged in 2 rows, spread out in the open space. I think I forgot something." Madam Hooch approached from a distance. Upon seeing the professor, Dylan immediately returned to his study mode. "Good afternoon, young wizards. Now, everyone, stand to the left of your broomsticks. Quick." Madam Hooch, with her short, neatly combed gray hair, had a sharp, well-defined face and thick, slightly raised eyebrows. As soon as she reached the young wizards from both houses, she quickly and decisively directed everyone to quickly get to class. The freshmen, who had been grouped together, quickly split into 2 rows. As the first person approached their broomstick, the others from their house quickly followed. Dylan joined Neville, Harry, and the others. He lowered his eyes and glanced at the broomstick at his feet. The wood was dark, the bristles uneven, some even charred and broken. The ropes were loose, and several planks were missing from the end. He seriously suspected that something might happen while flying on this broomstick, perhaps even falling apart mid-ride. Can this broom still take me flying? It can't even fly, right? Very good. Now, stretch out your left hand, place it just above the broom handle, and shout, "Get up, get up." A group of young wizards shouted one after another. Almost every new student passed it in one go. After Dylan shouted, the tattered broom actually jumped up on the spot, allowing him to hold the end of the broom. If you want to learn to fly, posture is the first priority. But before that, I need you to remember the key points of flying, and you must keep the safety precautions firmly in mind. Madam Hooch's voice was hoarse but powerful, with a penetrating texture. Chapter 29 The Dangers of Flying Lessons. Remember, when standing on your broom, keep your feet in the correct position, maintain your balance, lean slightly forward, and keep your knees bent naturally. Madam Hooch walked back and forth between the 2 rows, harshly reprimanding anyone with incorrect form. "Malfoy, relax your arms a little, and make sure you can control the broom." Madam Hooch walked back and forth several times, each time spotting Malfoy's incorrect form. This forced her to correct him. Malfoy's face grew redder with each correction, his form becoming stiffer instead of better. Ron snickered at the side. Dylan ignored her and quickly mastered the correct and safe position. Until Madam Hooch began to check each young wizard's form. Dylan passed smoothly. Ron, who had been snickering a little earlier, was also reprimanded by Madam Hooch for his crooked form. In fact, It wasn't just Malfoy and Ron who were being corrected by Madam Hooch. Everyone, except Dylan, had received a reprimand from Madam Hooch to some extent. While Madam Hooch was checking the other young wizards' safe flying positions, Dylan took the opportunity to inspect their broomsticks. Since it wasn't a requirement for the admissions checklist, and Hogwarts provided students with broomsticks for instructional purposes, Dylan hadn't yet purchased his own. He did have some idea of what a low-end broomstick, like the shooting star, used at school, would cost about 20 galleons. A Comet 140, about 80 galleons, was considered mid-range. Prices generally ranged from 100 to 300 galleons. High-end brooms, like the Firebolt, were still in the development phase, and the starting price was likely in the 5 figures. The Nimbus 2000, on the other hand, only cost a little over 300 galleons. Dylan had been completing various achievements recently, earning him a considerable amount of galleons. He wanted to buy a broom, a simple one. However, he planned to wait until he had mastered flying, then buy a Nimbus 2000 as a backup. There was no need to use a cheap broom as a temporary fix, he wouldn't need to take off regularly. Instead, he could study apparition instead. It does have a standard levitation charm. Dylan fiddled with the broom for a while, quickly determining what kind of enchantment had been applied to the broom in his hand. Wizards could recast a levitation charm when using a broom. However, the broom itself was also equipped with levitation charms, propulsion charms, and other spells. Dylan also sensed the presence of a balance charm. One thing had always puzzled him when watching TV series. Would wizards flying around on a broom really not get their pants stuck in their crotch? Wouldn't it feel uncomfortable? After studying the broom for a while, Dylan discovered that it was also enchanted with a cushion charm. It looked like just a stick, but once you sat on it, you sat on an invisible cushion. It's just a lousy broom, with only a few pitiful spells cast on it. Dylan shook his head. He couldn't even sense any special patterns on the broom, and the material wasn't particularly good. It wasn't worth studying. So Dylan stopped fiddling with it and placed the broom under his hips. Sitting on the cushion, he waited for Madam Hooch's next command. Once everyone's posture was strictly corrected, Madam Hooch prepared to let them attempt their first takeoff. Listen carefully to my command. As soon as the whistle sounds, you must push off the ground with all your might. Do you understand? You must push. Imagine you can fly. Madam Hooch, dressed in a black Quidditch referee robe with a green lining, walked with a swagger that wasn't as powerful as Professor Snape's, but still carried a certain imposing presence. She had already raised a wooden whistle. Now, get ready. You just need to rise a few feet, hover briefly, then keep your body tilted and return to the ground. Listen to my whistle. 3, 2, Madam Hooch hadn't even finished her words when Neville, standing next to Dylan, involuntarily pushed off the ground with his feet and instantly floated into the air. What are you doing? Get down. Professor Hooch's eyes pierced. She'd thought the young wizard was deliberately trying to take off before the others. However, after she finished speaking, Neville, with a look of panic on his face, soared higher and higher. Dylan frowned and immediately drew his staff from his waist. Powder. Finite incantatem. Dylan quickly cast a stopping spell. However, when the spell hit the broom, it had no effect. He frowned. Because the broom spell was engraved on its interior, wasn't Neville using the spell, and there was no way to stop it? Before he could even think, Neville was already flying wildly in the air. He cast 2 more spells. Retardo Modus, Arresto Momentum, 2 spells blared. This time, Neville finally stopped swaying in the air and slowed down. However, since Dylan hadn't mastered the spells completely, the effect was only moderate. But at least it slowed Neville down gradually, preventing him from stopping immediately and falling. Just as Dylan was thinking this, Neville suddenly flipped over and landed upside down. Huh? I didn't even use that spell, Dylan glared. Neville suddenly screamed. His hand slipped off the broom, and he plummeted from the sky. Impedimenta, as the spell uttered, a strange, shimmering stream of magic erupted from the tip of his wand. Strands of magic, one after another, wrapped around Neville's body. In an instant, his mad descent came to a halt, and he actually slowed down considerably. Wingardium Leviosa, Dylan cast another spell, forcibly controlling Neville's body, allowing him to slowly land under his control. By this point, Neville was completely stunned, his face still etched with fear. His hair, tangled from the wind, was still scattered across his face. Oh my God, Harry exclaimed. Flying lessons were so dangerous. Hermione's eyes widened as well. However, she was amazed at how many spells Dylan could use. And he seemed to be quite proficient in each one. Chapter 30, If you fall into the water, only your mouth will float up. How are you? Madam Hooch strode forward to Neville's side, looking down at the chubby little man sitting on the lawn, his expression still a bit stiff. Neville didn't say anything, but tears welled up in his eyes. He looked genuinely frightened. Dylan stepped forward, unconcerned about whether Neville was injured or not. Ipisky, the wood grain of his wand faintly emerged in the dim light. With a gentle wave of his wand, a faint, soft golden light emanated from the tip. Neville finally came to his senses and looked at his knee. It doesn't hurt anymore. Dylan raised an eyebrow. His proficiency in the levitation charm was already quite high, but the little man was quite heavy. In his haste, he hadn't been able to fully absorb the impact of the man's fall. He probably had some minor scrapes, but it shouldn't be a big deal. And with his multiple spells, Neville didn't seem to have suffered any serious internal injuries. At most, he was just a little startled. After a few potions, the bitter taste was almost gone. Madam Hooch still held her wand, but she stared blankly at Dylan, who circled Neville 3 times, seemingly checking to see if the young wizard had sustained any other injuries. Madam Hooch, my healing is new may not completely heal Neville's wounds, and if he has any internal injuries, it's difficult for us to detect them. Dylan looked up at Madam Hooch. So, please take him to the infirmary. Madam Hooch came to her senses, glanced at Dylan, and nodded gently. You did very well. She hadn't expected that she, a flying professor, could handle a student's accident better than a first year. She had witnessed so many flying accidents, and she felt that young wizards needed more training before they could master flying. However, she realized that her standards couldn't be applied to first-year students. After helping Neville to his feet, Madam Hooch turned back to Dylan, lost in thought. You reacted quickly and handled the situation perfectly. 5 points to Gryffindor for that. Wow, the Gryffindor lion cubs cheered. The Slytherin snakes, however, pouted, their faces etched with disapproval. Now, everyone, put your broomsticks back in their proper places. No one is allowed to fly until I take Mr. Longbottom to the hospital. Before leaving, Madam Hooch sternly warned the young wizards, anyone who dares to fly without permission will be expelled. Dylan didn't accompany Madam Hooch to take Neville to the infirmary. After Madam Hooch left, the young wizard stood there in stunned silence. Suddenly, Malfoy emerged, broom in hand. Hey, did you see that fat guy's face? My god, that's hilarious. How could someone not even hold a broom? Malfoy's voice was rather arrogant. Harry and Ron glanced over in disapproval. Malfoy stared back defiantly, his mouth still chattering. Dylan narrowed his eyes. He remembered that during flying class, Malfoy and Harry had gotten into a fight over Neville's Remembrall. This time, he'd stuffed Neville's Remembrall into his backpack and hadn't brought it with him, but Malfoy was still going to pick a fight. He walked right up to Malfoy. Malfoy paused. The spells Dylan had just unleashed were beyond the capabilities of even a Slytherin like him. Add to that Dylan's exceptional performance in every class over the past 2 weeks, and Malfoy felt a head shorter than his enemy. What do you want to do? Malfoy glared at Dylan, his face threatening. All of us from our house are here. He glanced around at the young Slytherin wizards, but none of them dared to meet Dylan's gaze, their heads lowered. You? Malfoy choked. Dylan's eyes were calm. Mr. Draco, I don't understand how you, with your idiocy, managed to survive in this cold and indifferent world. What? Malfoy's eyes widened as he stared at Dylan in disbelief, seemingly unable to believe what he had just heard. Do you know who my mother is? How dare you speak to me like that? Your parents are just muggles. This time, Dylan's gaze shifted. It became as if he were looking at a fool. What I mean is, failure is the mother of success. You're just a little bit attached to your mother. Dylan had no desire to bicker with a little wizard, it was too boring. Furthermore, he didn't care whether Malfoy loved Harry or not. Because of his awkward male chauvinism, he just wanted to express his love by bullying Harry. He didn't want to be everyone's spiritual mentor, and he couldn't possibly be. So, just as Malfoy was about to open his mouth again, he raised his wand. Silentio. In an instant, an invisible magical force, like a tight spell, instantly locked Malfoy's throat. Malfoy stopped abruptly before he could utter the vicious curse he'd racked his brains to conjure. Only his eyes, wide and wide, burned with a mixture of rage and astonishment. He clutched his tightly closed mouth, his sharp lips trembling slightly from the exertion, and his cheeks puffed out. He looked like an enraged pufferfish suddenly silenced. He drew his wand, attempting to undo Dylan's spell. However, he hadn't mastered either the stop spell or the antiphonal charm, and couldn't use them. Compared to Dylan's fluid spellcasting, the difference was obvious. The Gryffindor lions nearby all burst into laughter. Ron and Harry even rushed to Dylan's side, their faces gleaming with excitement. But Dylan stopped them from mocking Malfoy. As a pure-blood wizard from Slytherin, I hope you can improve your magic, rather than becoming a person who falls into the water and only has his mouth float up. Dylan gently waved his wand, breaking the spell. Malfoy was still glaring at Dylan, but he didn't dare to say another word. He hadn't expected that this Gryffindor guy was not only smart, but also knew so many spells. The key point was, his mouth was even more poisonous than those Slytherins. I hope you can keep quiet and don't disturb me. Shaking his head, Dylan put his broomstick back where it was. Then he sat down on the lawn, took out the safe use guide for potions, and read it carefully over and over again. Chapter 31 Dylan's way of releasing stress. Dylan believed that reading potions material only once was absolutely forbidden, as it was likely to overlook something. Only through repeated reading could the knowledge in the book become one's own. Dylan believed that potions material was complex and involved many key techniques, requiring countless details to be memorized. Otherwise, a single, insignificant mistake could lead to the failure of the entire potion. With Snape, the potion's master, personally guiding him, Dylan didn't want to waste time on minor errors. So, the young Gryffindor and Slytherin wizards saw Dylan sitting alone in the distance, pulling out a book and perusing with gusto. Each side formed a group, wanting to argue but hesitant. The Slytherin snakes, fearing they might get too noisy, began to cast the silencing charm on them all. They had never learned this spell before, and therefore had no idea how to break it. While the spell of instantaneous spell wasn't considered a high-level spell, many young wizards could use it. But how to use their instant stop spell to break Dylan's spell was another problem. Someone had already tried it, and it didn't work. The Gryffindors simply didn't want to disturb Dylan's reading. After all, the more Dylan knew, the more they, the Gryffindors, knew. And the less the Slytherins were inferior to them, the less the Slytherins knew. So, the more Dylan knew, the less the Slytherins knew. If they could just outmaneuver these Slytherins, then these little lions would rally to whatever Dylan wanted to do. Long live Hawkwood. For a moment, both sides stared at each other, neither saying a word. The young wizards of the two houses stared at each other, the atmosphere clearly tense, yet an eerie silence prevailed. Only when Madame Hooch returned with Neville did Dylan put away his book and stand. Mr. Longbottom was fortunately not seriously injured. The only scrape on his knee was healed with your spell, Madame Hooch said. Dylan nodded slightly. Well, young wizards, now you understand how dangerous flying is, don't you? Madame Hooch regrouped everyone and immediately resumed the lesson. At the end of the lesson, Harry and Malfoy both demonstrated considerable flying talent. Dylan's flying was average, not particularly outstanding. After class, Ron approached Dylan and said slyly, "You were so cool just now. You had those Slytherins so stunned that none of them dared to talk back to you. I seriously doubt you're actually a true Slytherin," Ron muttered to himself, nodding his head. Yes, if you weren't from a Muggle family, you would definitely be sorted into Slytherin. Even Professor Snape would be embarrassed by you. Dylan glanced at him and raised his wand. This little guy really has a way with words. Should he be shattered to pieces, or ripped apart? Seeing Dylan raise his wand, Ron immediately shrank back, falling back a step to follow Harry again. Hey, Harry. When Madame Hooch praised your flying talent and recommended you for the Quidditch team today, didn't you see Malfoy's face? He was so pissed off. Harry smiled back. They headed towards the Great Hall, ready for dinner. Just as he found a seat, Harry said, "Mrs. Hooch said she'd take me somewhere. She's going to make an exception and recommend you for the Quidditch team." My God, a first-year wizard can go straight to Quidditch. Those Slytherins will be pissed. Ron's face was filled with excitement. Dylan paid no attention to any of this. Instead enjoying his dinner. During flying class, he felt like he could control his broom with greater ease. However, he didn't do it because he didn't want any professor to recommend him for a Quidditch team. Wait until I buy a Nimbus 2000. I can practice in the morning when no one's around. Dylan brought over a freshly appeared steak. The steak sizzled, its rich, mellow meaty aroma tinged with hints of milk and a refreshing peppery aroma. Hogwarts food was far superior to his usual white-skinned meals. Take the steak, for example. The edges were slightly charred, and the juices seeped through the veins, forming a glistening pool on the plate. He cut a small piece and placed it in his mouth, his teeth immediately experiencing the charred exterior and tender interior. The steak's crispy, charred aroma blended perfectly with the tender, juicy meat within. As he chewed, the juices overflowed, and the rich beef flavor, accompanied by a milky aroma, spread across his tongue. Do the house elves use some kind of magic when they cook? It tastes completely different from steaks you buy outside, Dylan was curious. If such magic really existed, then once he mastered it, he could cook his own food without overcooking it. The setting sun streamed through the window, casting a delicate shadow onto the wooden dining table, gilding the dishes on his plate. Dylan's mind was completely focused, the pressure of his daily studies vanishing into the background, leaving only the delicious food before him and a sense of inner peace. This was a good way for Dylan to relieve stress. Even in his constant pursuit of knowledge, he still felt a flicker of pressure. This was perfectly normal. When pressure existed, it needed to be released. His achievements had merely freed him from negative emotions when practicing dark magic, but that didn't mean he didn't experience them on a regular basis. Accumulating too much pressure would inevitably become a burden, potentially even transforming into negative emotions. He couldn't guarantee that if he displeased someone, he wouldn't immediately unleash a bomb curse on their head, or even shatter them into pieces. Therefore, during the brief moment of dinner each day, Dylan would completely focus on his food, thinking of nothing else, letting the stress slowly dissipate with each chew. However, when one desires leisure, trouble always presents itself. Malfoy and his men rushed into the auditorium, quickly pinpointing their location and storming over. Dylan didn't even glance at them. However, upon seeing Dylan, Malfoy's surging momentum immediately receded. After a brief hesitation, under the gaze of his followers, Malfoy finally stepped forward. Chapter 32. Do you think old Dang won't do anything behind the scenes? Potter. Do you dare challenge me to a wizard duel? Malfoy glanced at Dylan furtively, and seeing that he completely ignored his advances, his eyes lit up. Did this guy have a fight with Harry? Haha, Harry, that idiot, just loves hanging out with lowly people. That must be why he provoked him. His aura grew stronger as he thought of this, but his voice remained low. He hadn't forgotten what Dylan had said about his preference for quiet. Harry had actually clashed with Malfoy during the latter part of flying class, over a test flight assessment between their respective houses. However, with Madame Hooch keeping them in check, neither dared to go too far. They hadn't expected Malfoy to suddenly come and challenge them after class was over. Faced with this situation, Harry, who had always been indifferent to this man who looked down on his friend, naturally wouldn't back down. Would that mean he was afraid of Malfoy? He just didn't know what a wizard duel was. Just as he was contemplating how to respond, Ron suddenly stood up and accepted Malfoy's challenge for Harry. It's just a wizard duel, right? We're on it. Hermione tried to stop him, but Ron spoke too quickly. Even after Malfoy and his minions had left, she didn't have time to get a word in. Hermione watched Ron and Harry sit down again, their heads huddled together, whispering quietly. Hermione glared. A wizard duel? You want your house to lose a lot of points? That's against school rules. Ron glanced at her nonchalantly. As long as we do it secretly, we won't be caught. Hermione looked at her like she was stupid. How can you guarantee you won't be caught? If you get caught, all the points Dylan and I earned for our house will be deducted. You can't be so selfish. We're trying to save Gryffindor from losing face in front of Slytherin. Harry and Ron turned their heads away, no longer looking at Hermione. No matter what Hermione said, they both knew they hadn't heard. Hermione glanced at Dylan, who was not far away. By then, Dylan had finished the last piece of steak, a look of satisfaction on his face. I'm full now. I'll have more energy to read soon. Hey, they're hell-bent on becoming fighting cocks. I seriously suspect they've fallen under some kind of childish dueling spell. Can't you try to dissuade them? Dylan blinked at Hermione's words. What do you want to dissuade them from? Hermione's eyes widened again. Of course, dissuade them from breaking the school rules. Dylan glanced at Harry. As Hermione approached Dylan, Ron and Harry had stopped their loud conspiracies and glanced at Dylan from the corner of their eyes. Seeing each other's gazes, they quickly lowered their heads. If Hermione had dissuaded them from dueling, they wouldn't have listened, but if it were Dylan. My personal opinion, Hermione, grades are just a fleeting footnote in life. They can't anchor the value of life. Dylan's lips curled into a faint smile, and he gazed calmly at Hermione. What we really need to focus on is the focus we put into striving for extra points, and the sparks that spark in our minds when we tackle a difficult problem, not the final, cold number. If you can understand that grades don't define our souls and lives, I guarantee that even in this entire school year, you'll be able to reach heights far higher than you can currently. Dylan's voice exuded a calmness beyond his years, clear and unadulterated, each word delivered with inherent ease. Hermione was stunned, her mind clicked. But for a moment, she couldn't grasp the meaning of Dylan's words. She felt that grades were still important. How could they not be? And after all this chatter, Dylan wasn't going to stand by her side? So you're not going to persuade them? Dylan shook his head. Hermione glared. Humph. You boys are unreasonable. Wait until the house cup falls into the hands of another house, and you'll know how powerful you are. She stood up angrily and strode out of the hall. Dylan looked at Hermione's back and shook his head helplessly. He had absolutely no desire to get involved in Harry and Malfoy's affairs. After all, he was the future savior, so it was normal for him to be a little aggressive right now. Malfoy had come to bother Harry earlier, and although he hadn't noticed, he had overheard the entire incident. He hadn't intervened because, firstly, he was enjoying his dinner, and secondly, there was no need for him to get involved. As he had said to Hermione, points were completely useless to him, learning 2 more spells was more practical. Perhaps winning the House Cup would give him another achievement. But, not to mention whether Harry and Malfoy's plan to duel late at night would be discovered. Even if they were discovered, how many points would be deducted? Even if all the points were taken away, Dumbledore wouldn't let the House Cup fall into the hands of the other 3 houses. Then, with some backroom dealings, wouldn't the cup still be theirs? Could anyone still think Dumbledore wasn't secretly giving Harry the green light? So, with Harry around, he didn't really need to worry about many of the house matters. Focusing on studying his magic, and with Harry's help, igniting his own achievements. Isn't that the best of both worlds? I knew Dylan you wouldn't be like Hermione, watching Gryffindor being laughed at by Slytherin, seeing Hermione leave in anger, and Dylan making no attempt to stop them. Ron excitedly rushed over and gave Dylan a bear hug. Dylan had just stood up from his chair, but when he saw Ron's action, his calm expression changed, and his eyes widened. Ron froze in place, and awkwardly withdrew his hand. I have no objection to you wanting to duel, but since you've made a decision, you will have to bear the consequences yourself. Dylan's expression calmed down again, and he glanced at Ron and Harry. As a friend, I still have to remind you of this. After a moment's thought, he added, also, don't expect to be discovered. Both houses will lose points, and the teacher who catches you dueling might be Professor Snape. Huh? Dylan's words made Ron and Harry, who had been full of ambition, shudder. The image of that cold and mean face surfaced in their minds. I'm going to ask the professor for some private lessons. You'll be on your own. Dylan picked up his bag, packed his belongings, and then took out his notebook. He flipped through it as he walked towards the auditorium door. Chapter 33. Is this magic so subjective? Special treatment. Ron blinked. Is he not full? He needs the professor to make him another meal? Is he already so close to the professors? Harry looked at him. Dylan should be going to the professor for extra lessons. Oh. Sometimes I really think Dylan should go to Ravenclaw. You've already assigned Dylan to 3 houses. Which one is he going to go to? Gryffindor, of course. Dylan walked all the way to Professor McGonagall's office and knocked on the door. Come in. Professor McGonagall's dignified voice came from inside. Good afternoon, Professor McGonagall. Dylan pushed the door open. Professor McGonagall was sitting at her desk, her quill scratching against a parchment. Seeing that it was Dylan who came to her for extra lessons, Professor McGonagall raised her eyes slightly, looking at Dylan calmly through her square glasses. Your performance in today's flying class seemed average. Are there any concerns about flying? Dylan walked over to Professor McGonagall. In the corner was a small stool, specially prepared for him by Professor McGonagall. Dylan pulled it over, sat down, and blinked. Professor, you're incredibly well informed. I just finished my flying lesson. Professor McGonagall glanced out the window. From where I sit, I can see your flying practice. I see Harry has quite a talent for flying. Madam Hooch also told me about this. We're planning on recommending Harry for the Gryffindor Quidditch team. As for you, I watched you from the window for a while. You seem pretty good. Dylan smiled. Flying around in the sky is really scary. I'll just practice bit by bit. Hearing Dylan's words, Professor McGonagall said nothing more. "What questions did you prepare for today?" Dylan immediately placed a notebook on the desk and pushed it towards Professor McGonagall. "Professor, I've gained some preliminary experience with transfiguration, and recently I've been trying to transform inanimate objects into living things, but I've run into some problems." Professor McGonagall took Dylan's notes and examined them carefully. "Although you explained the nature of the transfiguration spell, when I tried to transform the apple into a rabbit, I clearly controlled my wand movements precisely, and the magic output was smooth and consistent, and I've also studied the anatomy of rabbits, so I can be sure that what I imagined was indeed a rabbit. However, during the transformation process, the initial transformation went smoothly, but once the rabbit was formed, it seemed limp and lifeless. I've also studied rabbit habits, and that shouldn't be the case." Dylan pointed to a spot in his notebook. "I'm wondering if there's a problem with the adaptation of life magic, as mentioned in Advanced Transfiguration explained." As Dylan spoke, Professor McGonagall flipped through her notes, leaning forward slightly, listening intently to Dylan's question. After he finished speaking, Professor McGonagall didn't answer immediately. Instead, she read through Dylan's latest notes on transfiguration in the notebook. Then, she put it down and looked at Dylan. "Some of the ideas you've put forward in your notebook are quite novel, which is very good." Professor McGonagall sat upright, her hands folded on the table, the corners of her lips curled slightly as she spoke slowly. "As for your problem, I think the crux of the matter lies in your lack of understanding of the connection between magic and the essence of life. When you try to transform inanimate objects into living creatures, the movement of your wand and the output of your magic are the most basic actions. It's good that you've taken the time to study the structure and even the habits of living things. This is also essential when practicing transfiguration. However, even if you have a mental picture of your target, besides feeling its vitality, agility, and instincts, the most important thing is that you need to imagine your magic, not just simple magic, but truly living magic." Dylan raised an eyebrow slightly. Living magic, he had read about this in the book. Life magic is a special form of magic, primarily manifesting in magic related to the creation and characteristics of life. Dylan had originally assumed this meant that, when studying spells like transfiguration and imbuing magical creatures with specific vitality, he simply relied on the wizard's deep understanding of the nature of life. In other words, when using magic related to life, magic could be understood as life magic. He hadn't expected that so-called life magic would require him to imagine that the magic he was using was actually life magic. "So that's idealistic," he grumbled inwardly. But a smile crossed his face. "So that's how it is. I think I understand." Professor McGonagall nodded gently. "Generally speaking, life magic originates from the wizard's inner strength and is closely connected to their spirit, emotions, and understanding of life. So, when you attempt to study transfiguration, in addition to integrating your own feelings and understanding of life into your magic, you must also believe that your magic can produce the effect of bringing inanimate objects to life." Dylan nodded again. "Since you mentioned life magic, I'll briefly explain my understanding of it." Professor McGonagall looked at him with a hint of anticipation. Dylan said seriously, "Life magic, while a wizard's inner strength, also has a deeper connection with the life force of nature that I can't yet grasp. Thus, during transfiguration, the two are connected, and it determines the success or failure, the good or bad of the transformation." Professor McGonagall's eyes lit up at this, her lips curling up in a rare, hearty smile, and the fine lines around her eyes smoothed. "Dylan, your understanding of magic is quite profound, quite rare for a first-year wizard." She patted Dylan's shoulder gently. "You're right. The magic within a wizard has the potential to transform into life magic, but not all uses of magic are manifestations of life magic. When a wizard casts certain spells, they need to resonate with the life force of nature. You can think of it as drawing energy from nature, combining it with your magic, and together they give the magical creation true vitality." Professor McGonagall taught Dylan many key points, the essential meanings hidden behind the words that Dylan had difficulty exploring in books. Dylan learned a lot. Chapter 34 Level 5 Transfiguration Spell. As the hours grew later, Professor McGonagall finally paused. She glanced at the clock and felt that time had flown by so quickly. A flicker of regret flashed across her eyes, and she smiled at Dylan, saying, "Let's stop here for today. It's getting late, and you have classes tomorrow. Go back and get some rest." Dylan nodded with a hint of satisfaction. As expected of Professor McGonagall, she personally authored the Advanced Transfiguration Guide. She got to the heart of many issues, news, Your transfiguration proficiency has increased. Current progress is 50%. Dylan glanced at his transfiguration proficiency. Another level. Straight to level 5. Great, it was all worth the painstaking effort of all those days. He'd run to Professor McGonagall whenever he had something to do. He'd even coax the Hogwarts' deputy headmaster into giving him mini lectures every day. These lectures would last for hours, almost as if he'd dragged the elderly professor through the night. However, even if you've mastered the basics of transfiguring inanimate objects, there's still a lot to learn about transfiguring living things. The transfiguration spell is an extremely complex one, and it gets harder to increase your proficiency as you advance. However, if you can find a key trick, your proficiency level might actually jump. Thankfully, I have so many max level spells. While the spells may differ, magic always has some commonalities. Once you understand the principles of one spell, you can apply them to other spells. For example, he recently studied Shatter and Pulverize. He learned incredibly quickly. Even taking online classes at full speed couldn't catch up. While these aren't considered dark arts, the principles and essence of these two spells share many similarities with several offensive spells in the dark arts. With just a glance, he quickly mastered them. His proficiency level skyrocketed. While not reaching max level overnight, it was definitely comparable to a mature wizard's mastery of these two spells. Time to go back to bed. After Dylan packed his things, he said goodbye to Professor McGonagall, left her office, and headed for his dorm. He entered the Gryffindor common room in his dorm. He saw Harry and Ron sitting on a bed, whispering to each other. Seeing him back, Ron greeted him. Dylan nodded slightly. Looking down, he saw a dark figure swoosh out from his bed. "Good evening, Cole Ball." Seeing his own Cole Ball, Dylan's smile grew even softer. Ever since he got his license to keep a Uzumaki, he'd found time during lunch to bring Cole Ball to his dorm. He planned to keep him indoors. Not even the other young wizards in Gryffindor knew he had such a magical creature. Harry and Neville, of course, wouldn't tell anyone about it. Only Ron, who couldn't control his mouth today, wanted to brag about Dylan raising a Uzumaki. But each attempt was promptly stopped by Hermione and Harry. After all, Shadow wasn't a pet allowed at Hogwarts in the traditional sense. Furthermore, Shadow was quite aggressive and possessed considerable combat power. Even if it wasn't fully grown, it was still more than capable of preying on young wizards who didn't know much magic. Therefore, Dylan didn't want to leave Shadow in plain sight, lest they cause him trouble. Moo! Shadow approached gracefully, then suddenly stopped just as it was within striking distance of Dylan. The little creature raised its chin slightly, its tail wagging softly, and glared at Dylan sideways, as if to say, "I didn't come to greet you." However, the next moment, Dylan made a beeline for the table. Seeing that Dylan didn't reach out to embrace it, Shadow glared and scurried over, slowly circling Dylan's feet. From time to time, it gently nudged his calf with its head, pausing deliberately between each nudity. Placing his school bag beside the table, Dylan smiled as he squatted down and cradled Cole Ball in his arms. Moo! Cole Ball, lying on its back, tilted its head and let out a proud cry. Dylan smiled, then cleaned himself up with a duster. He didn't feel like washing up today, so he'd just use his magic to get by for the night. He took off his shoes and placed them neatly beside the bed, changed into his pajamas, and climbed into bed. He lifted a corner of the covers, held Cole Ball in one hand, and dove into the covers. As soon as he lay down, he couldn't help but let out a long sigh of relief. His expression relaxed, his eyes slightly closed, and the corners of his mouth unconsciously curled up into a contented smile. So comfortable, Dylan swung his legs and tucked himself into the covers, letting them wrap around him tightly. He could feel Cole Ball finding a comfortable position in his arms. Its furry head nudged here, sniffed there, and its paws occasionally scratched gently. After a while, it finally sated itself and curled up into a ball, nestling against his chest. Its eyes closed, and soon, its breathing became even and slow. Ron and Harry blinked beside it. They stared at each other. "No, it's asleep already. It seems Dylan really doesn't intend to go with us to duel Slytherin. Why don't we ask him later? Will that be too late?" "Just ask," the two men whispered to each other, tidied themselves up briefly, and without even taking off their clothes, they jumped into bed. Hours passed. Late at night, Hogwarts was completely silent. The two men snuck up again. As they were about to leave, Ron tugged at Harry and then led him to Dylan's bed. Like two generals, they fought for a long time, pushing and shoving each other, But in the end, they stared at Dylan, who was sleeping soundly in the bed. Harry finally gave in to Ron and sighed deeply. He stepped forward resignedly, swallowing his saliva. Then, reaching out, he raised his index finger and gently poked Dylan's face. Swish! Dylan's eyes flashed open, staring intently at the two uninvited guests in front of the bed. Ron and Harry were startled, and Harry quickly retracted his hand. He chuckled dryly and opened his mouth, but for a moment, words failed to form. Ron managed to whisper the words in one breath. Dylan, we're planning on dueling. Just wanted to ask you, are you really not coming with us? As Ron finished speaking, both men looked at Dylan with hope. But then, seeing the two dark green lights in Dylan's eyes, like will-o'-the-wisp, they pursed their lips, their faces tense, and smiled a slightly awkward smile. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 35 Dylan, we met the three-headed dog. Ron scratched his head and was about to speak when Harry covered his mouth. Good night, Dylan. Go to sleep, haha. Ron, unable to speak with his mouth covered, nodded hurriedly, like a chick pecking at rice. Come on, go, let's go. Harry pulled Ron. They hurriedly turned around, using their hands and feet, stumbling and holding their breath, not wanting to make too much noise. They gently lifted their feet and slowly lowered them, like two guilty thieves. They stretched their hands forward slightly, pawing at the air for balance. They reached the door and then bolted out, carefully closing it behind them before leaving. Ron even mouthed to Dylan through the crack in the door, "Go to sleep, are these two seriously ill?" Dylan watched the whole thing unfold, speechless. He wasn't quite as sleepy anymore, completely washed away by the two frivolous youngsters. "Did I tell you I wouldn't get involved? And you woke me up so late in the night." Honestly, Dylan wasn't quite happy. Of course, this definitely had nothing to do with his morning grumpiness. After a moment's hesitation, he sighed helplessly. He glanced down at the little cold ball, whose head had already emerged from the covers. Its eyes, like his own, shone with a dark glow. Dylan stretched out two fingers and pinched its head. "They're my friends, too. Go follow them and help them if necessary." "Moo," the little cold ball murmured softly. It knew there were other people sleeping in the dorm. "Go ahead. Haven't you made a lot of friends here?" Although he'd kept Cold Ball in the dorm since bringing it here today, the little guy had definitely sneaked out to have some fun. Because, tonight, Professor McGonagall had mentioned it during her private lesson. A little shadowy creature was sneaking around the school, even making its way to the Forbidden Forest, where it mingled with a group of wild magical creatures. The key point was that after returning to Hogwarts, the little shadowy creature, while not attracting much attention from the young wizards, had slipped into the restricted area. Finally, she noticed it while passing by. Hagrid had mentioned to her and Dumbledore that Dylan wanted to keep a shadowy creature, so she immediately thought it might be Dylan's pet and had the house elves take it back to the dormitory. Otherwise, if the little shadowy creature continued to roam, Filch might catch it. After hearing Professor McGonagall's words, Dylan immediately realized she was pointing a finger at him. What else could he say? He could only vaguely tell Professor McGonagall about his shadowy creature. Fortunately, Professor McGonagall didn't press for further details, simply advising him not to overthink his pet, but to still take good care of it. Naturally, Dylan agreed. Of course, Dylan had no intention of blaming Cold Ball for this. Ever since he'd been with him, Cold Ball had practically been confined to the pet space. He'd finally been let out in the open, so what was wrong with him having some fun? He hadn't bitten off a little wizard's head and eaten it, just taking a stroll. Dylan saw no problem with that. Moo, Cold Ball had been cocky and proud, but after hearing Dylan's words, he blinked guiltily and shrank back. "Go ahead, and remember to be careful." He tapped Cold Ball's head with his index finger. Whoosh, Cold Ball shot out in an instant. As it approached the door, its form mysteriously vanished. And it vanished through the door. Dylan sank back into bed. Fortunately, he slept well. It wasn't long before he fell asleep again. This time, no one disturbed him, and he slept through until dawn. Harry and the others had woken him up in the middle of the night, so he woke up once. As a result, he didn't wake up too early this time. He checked the time, around 6:30 a.m. Turning around, he saw Harry and Ron already back, still sound asleep. Little Cole was lazily nestled between his legs. He shook his head, telling her to stay in her dorm. He got up and prepared to pack up, go out to check on his owl, look through his potions notes, and then have breakfast and get ready for class. Cole's fur was like black satin, sensing its owner's movements, and it twitched its ears. Then, with a flip, it curled up in the covers. Walking out into the morning light, Dylan finished his morning lessons as planned. Then he arrived at the Great Hall. Many young wizards had already arrived for lunch, and several teachers were sitting in the classrooms. "Hey, Dylan, over here." As soon as he entered the Great Hall, Dylan spotted the Gryffindor seats, Harry and Ron waving at him vigorously. He slowly walked over and sat down next to Harry. Ron's face was filled with excitement. He glanced around. He lowered his head, lowered his voice, and said to Dylan, "Oh my God, you have no idea how exciting last night was." Dylan blinked. "Wow, how exciting." Ron didn't recognize Dylan's flat tone for a moment and smiled crookedly. "What a shame you didn't come. Also, that Malfoy is such a jerk. We agreed to duel, but he secretly jinxed it and informed Filch." "That's not what you said, Dylan." "He didn't tell Professor Snape." Looking at Ron's smug expression, Dylan opened his mouth and said, "Wow. That's a jerk." "Really?" Ron couldn't help but curl his lips at the thought of Malfoy. Hermione, standing beside him, touched her forehead. "Did this guy notice Dylan's attitude?" "You're stupid." No matter who Malfoy informed, he would have told the teachers anyway. Dylan was right to warn them. This time it was Ron's turn to blink. However, he did not dwell on this matter too much, but continued, "Then we were chased by Filch all the time, and that Mrs. Norris was also chasing us. Fortunately, they were suddenly attracted by something else. I don't know if it was another student, but we ran into Peeves again, and that guy chased us all the way to the restricted area on the 4th floor. Guess what happened? We actually saw a three-headed dog there. Oh my God, that three-headed dog was so big, I felt like it could eat me in one bite." Dylan picked up a piece of salad with a fork and chewed it, giving it enough emotional value. "Oh, that's terrible." At this time, Ron also reacted. He looked at Dylan and glared. "Hey. Chapter 36. Do you know what's even more exciting?" "Dylan, aren't you surprised at all?" "It's a three-headed dog," Ron pouted, glaring at Dylan. Dylan paused as he was about to drink his milk, his eyelashes fluttering. "Huh? How could that be?" "I'm so surprised." Gulp. He tilted his head back slightly, gulping down the milk. By the time he set the cup down, a light circle of milk had formed on his lips. Dylan flicked his tongue along his lips, then picked up his fork and prepared to eat an omelet. Seeing his relaxed and contented appearance, Ron couldn't help but brace himself on the table and sit up abruptly. "Oh my God, Dylan." His sudden rise in voice drew glances from many of the surrounding classmates. Ron paused, stiffened, and then shrank back, his head lowered, trying to get as close to Dylan as possible. "Three-headed dog. I mean, it's a three-headed dog. Aren't you curious about how powerful it is?" Dylan glanced at the silly boy and smacked his lips. "The headmaster has already said that those places are absolutely forbidden. You will die if you go there. So even if there are Dementors trapped there, it's not impossible. You know what Dementors are, right? Even if there aren't Dementors, you mentioned there are three-headed dogs. So there might be other creatures like basilisks and trolls. I'm really surprised you made it back in one piece, honestly," Dylan added at the end, fearing Ron wouldn't believe him. Ron's expression was as if he had pressed the pause button. After a moment of silence, he blinked rapidly. He curled his lips, scratched the back of his head with one hand, rubbed his feet back and forth on the ground, and lowered his head. "But last night was really exciting." Dylan smiled. "Do you know what's more exciting?" Ron looked at him with a crispy sausage in his mouth. "What?" "The three-headed dog has infinite power. Even an iron door will be shattered by its impact. At the same time, it has strong magic resistance and is almost immune to most spells. It has amazing bite force. Even the scales of a Hungarian hardtail dragon can be bitten through in one bite. If you want to describe it," Dylan cast a half smile on the sausage in Ron's mouth. "Does it feel crunchy when you chew it?" "It's the same when it eats you. When it's in its mouth, the first thing you'll hear is a popping sound. That's the sound of your body being bitten through, like a balloon being popped. Of course, while the middle head is holding you, the other heads won't be idle either. The left head will bite your head off, and the right head will stuff your legs into its mouth. In just a moment, your body, separated by the three heads, will meet in its throat and finally enter its stomach. Ron stared at Dylan's opening and closing mouth, his eyes bulging, the color draining from his face, and his lips trembling uncontrollably. Ugh! Ron retched and quickly spat out a half sausage in his mouth, but a few crumbs of sausage still clung to the corner of his mouth. Harry saw the sausage crumbs at the corner of Ron's mouth, swallowed, and calmly withdrew his hand that was about to take a sausage. Actually, I think Hermione isn't as bad as Ron says. She could have just abandoned us yesterday, but she ended up helping us a lot. Even getting through that locked door was almost entirely thanks to Hermione. She's really smart. Harry tried to put the three-headed dog aside. Ron quickly put down the sausage in his hand. He glanced at Hermione beside him. His mouth curled up to the sky. He clearly disagreed with Harry's statement, and said with a red face, "In fact, if she hadn't opened that door, how would we have encountered that big guy? That three-headed dog is really dangerous." Dylan said it would swallow us like sausages. Hermione narrowed her eyes, and she had the urge to pull out her thickest book and swing it directly at Ron's head. It's a shame there's no history class today, or that book on the history of magic would be very handy, she snorted and glared at Ron. In fact, if it weren't for me, you would have been caught by the professor and expelled in disgrace, Ron snorted and was about to retort. Seeing that Dylan no longer wanted to pay attention to them, he quickly changed the subject. I remember the day Hagrid took me to Diagon Alley. He took out a small cloth bag. It was the same day that Gringotts was attacked. After last night's actions, Harry couldn't help but suspect that the three-headed dog was placed in the restricted area, guarding something, and it was very likely the object Hagrid had brought out. But what exactly is that thing? Ron, attracted by Harry's words, muttered along with him. But after a long time of thinking, they couldn't figure out what it could be. Finally, they both turned their attention to Dylan. Dylan knew what Hagrid had taken out, the Philosopher's Stone, which, in his opinion, was not very useful. The most miraculous effect of the Philosopher's Stone is its ability to create the elixir of life. However, even if one could live a long enough life with this elixir, after only 300 to 500 years, the body would decay. Eventually, even shaking hands could result in a fracture. Dylan despised this painful existence. He believed that potions could surely create a more stable and perfect elixir of life, without the need for the Philosopher's Stone. It was just that wizards hadn't yet mastered the method. Dylan believed that if he brewed the potion 1,000 times, experiencing the different colors of the potion bubbling in the crucible, savoring the bitterness of success and failure, and taking in the pungent and strange smells, he would be able to forge a new path to immortality with his potion talent, which was growing through the achievement system. However, he was only 10 years old, and acquiring more magical knowledge was his top priority. As for immortality? Voldemort, it wasn't time for him to consider such a thing. Dumbledore, on the other hand, could start thinking about it. Dylan, what do you think that thing is? Seeing the two guys looking at him with wet eyes like puppies, Dylan resisted the urge to pet Ron and Harry's heads and put down his fork. If you think Hagrid put the thing in a restricted area and guarded it with a three-headed dog, it must be something very valuable. Chapter 37 Accumulated Pressure. You might even search the entire world and find only this one. Even if you had 1,000,000 galleons, you couldn't buy any information about it. Dylan paused, then added, of course, if you really had 1,000,000, you might be able to buy some information. Harry's eyes flickered with thought at this. It seems those people didn't take a single galleon when they raided Gringotts. Ron, still puzzled, pressed Dylan. So what is that thing? Dylan curled his lips. Even if it's a piece of shit, I don't know. He once again gave Ron a good idea. If you really want to know, why don't you ask Professor Dumbledore? Wasn't that the headmaster the one who sent Hagrid to get it? He must know. Ron, you want me dead, don't you? He shook his head repeatedly, silencing Dylan, and glanced furtively in the direction of the professor's chairs. How should we ask? Should we tell Professor Dumbledore that we snuck into the restricted area yesterday? Oh my god, he'll definitely expel us from Hogwarts. Harry shook his head like a rattle. Don't tell any professor about this. Dylan rolled his eyes. He already knew what Colball had done yesterday. If it weren't for Colball, Harry and the others might have been chased into the restricted area by Filch. But Colball was already halfway there, having taken Mrs. Norris and Filch away. Harry and the others still appeared in the right-hand corridor on the 4th floor. They saw and entered the room. As for Ron and the others, they said they were chased by Peeves. However, Peeves, a ghost that had existed since Hogwarts' founding and was a source of great trouble for every administrator, was merely a mischievous spirit. Technically, it wasn't even a ghost. Would it really chase the young wizard into the restricted area? After all, during the Battle of Hogwarts, Peeves showed absolute loyalty to the school. He even got into a fight with Voldemort and his Death Eaters. Even if such a guy enjoyed some mischief, would he really let a few first-year wizards who had just entered the academy face such a mortal danger? Dylan calmly glanced at old Dumbledore, who was sitting in the teacher's seat, slowly eating his meal. He remembered that although it was created by Voldemort, it had been modified by the system to have a certain degree of deterrence against spirits and evil creatures, the regeneration of the corpses. Since it had the effect of deterring spirits, then, with so many spells in the world, could there be a spell that could directly activate or even control spirits? As the greatest wizard of the 20th century, could old Dumbledore just happen to know such a spell? Even a younger Dark Lord like Voldemort could develop the regeneration of the corpses. Dumbledore, a contemporary of Grindelwald, had spent his youth with Grindelwald and had learned a lot about Grindelwald's dark magic. Dumbledore was never a staid, pedantic old man. Voldemort looked much more menacing now. However, if Dumbledore truly devoted himself to studying the dark arts, it was still uncertain whether Voldemort could challenge Dumbledore. Well, regardless of whether it was Dumbledore's doing or not, Harry and the others won't be in any danger, so why should I care? After dinner, the group rushed to the classroom. Thanks to Dylan's leadership, Harry, Ron, Neville, and the others were all motivated to study. They stopped sitting in the back rows and instead sat in the front row with Dylan. Of course, it wasn't because they realized that having Dylan around made the professor more accommodating when they were questioned, or that Dylan could occasionally provide them with tips to help them pass the professor's questions or tests. They simply wanted to sit in the front row and listen carefully. Friday was History of Magic. Hogwarts' only ghost professor mechanically explained the content from the slides to them. Finally, after a long day, Dylan's sleepy mind finally cleared up a bit. It's time to go see the professor for some private lessons. Dylan hurriedly packed up his things. Today, he had an appointment with Professor Sinistra, the astronomy teacher, to explore the much-talked-about stellar tides in the wizarding world. Dylan was deeply interested in this subject. Astronomy might seem unimportant, but the fact that it's a required course for young wizards speaks volumes. Furthermore, after studying astronomy for a while, Dylan discovered that many names are derived from astronomical phenomena and celestial bodies. Take, for example, astronomy professor Aurora Sinistra. Aurora can mean dawn or aurora, while Sinistra is the name of a star in the constellation Ophiuchus. Then there's the very intuitive Sirius Black, and even Draco Malfoy. Draco also refers to the constellation Draco. This demonstrates that pure-blood wizards place great importance on various celestial bodies and galaxies. This, in turn, indirectly demonstrates that wizards' power is undoubtedly connected to the stars. Even if these considerations are disregarded, if one wishes to study divination, one must understand which stars are which. Dylan hadn't been studying divination in depth lately, simply because he hadn't fully grasped astronomy. Time flew by, practically in the blink of an eye. During this time, Dylan's life was quite fulfilling. He would rise early for morning classes and receive private lessons from the professor in the evenings. Even on Saturdays and Sundays, Harry and the others rarely saw Dylan in the dorms during the day. Hermione's relationship with Harry and the others had also grown stronger during this period. After all, they had been through thick and thin together. For example, they had broken school rules together and even escaped death together, practically forming a comradeship. Even if they had initially disdained each other, it wasn't necessary that they couldn't become friends after all this time. Fortunately, Dylan was busy, but Harry wasn't idle either. Wood considered him a true savior, the savior of the Gryffindor Quidditch team. He was dragged through relentless training. While he didn't wake up at 4 or 5 like Dylan, he still had to be up by 7 every day. After Dylan finished his private lessons with a professor, he'd often run into Harry on his way back to the dorm. In this short period of time, Dylan quickly mastered a wealth of spell knowledge. He even unlocked several new achievements, further enriching his small coffers and magical talents. However, Dylan's stress gradually built up as he punched in like a robot every day. Until Chapter 38. You are only a freshman, and you want to compete with a professor in terms of knowledge? Hey, Dylan, how are you feeling? After lunch, Neville, for the rare occasion of seeing Dylan in the dorm on a Sunday, looked at him as he entered. His hair was a mess, and his expression was dazed and blank. He seemed to have just returned from the library, his arms clutching a thick stack of books. Huh? What do you mean? Dylan's posture was slightly hunched, his shoulders slumped as he clutched his books. His eyes were dull, and his lips were chapped and an unhealthy pale. Neville blinked. I mean, you seem to be in terrible shape right now. Seamus was also in the dorm. He nodded repeatedly. Even Colball jumped off the bed, walked over to Dylan with a cat-like gait, sat down obediently, and raised his head. Moo, Dylan placed his textbooks on the table, then rubbed his aching temple. Am I in such a bad state? Neville and Seamus nodded enthusiastically. Moo, Colball nodded his head. Dylan gave an embarrassed smile. This morning, I was discussing spells with Professor Flitwick. You know, professors know so much. During private lessons, what Professor Flitwick taught me was completely different from what he taught me in class. Dylan sighed slightly. I seriously suspect the knowledge he taught me is beyond the scope of a 7th-year wizard's understanding. This morning, in just 20 minutes, he even introduced me to content from 3 books I'd never read, plus 2 extremely obscure journals I'd never even heard of. So that's why, Dylan gestured to the books on the table. So I didn't have to struggle so much next time, so I went to the library and borrowed all these books. Dylan muttered nervously. I feel like I still know too little. Compared to the professors, my knowledge base is so limited. I need to read more books, like this book on the deciphering of ancient runic spells. I haven't delved into it yet. There's also the secrets of nonverbal spells, elemental spells and natural forces, the interpretation of dream spells. I need to learn them quickly. Neville and Seamus were stunned. They exchanged a glance, finding it difficult to respond to Dylan's words. Wasn't even 7th grade enough for Dylan? 7th graders aren't wizards anymore. Did the roommate intend to absorb all the knowledge in the library in just 1 year? Merlin's knows. You're only a 1st year. And you're already expecting your knowledge to surpass that of the Hogwarts professors? They both swallowed and glanced at Dylan, who seemed a little off. Neville took a deep breath and continued, Dylan, you've worked very hard. And you know far more than all the young wizards in our grade. Seamus nodded repeatedly. That's right. Dylan, you work very hard. Neville, I think. Why don't you just take a break? You've been studying so intensely for a long time. Seamus nodded repeatedly. Yes, for a long time. Neville, no? Why don't you join me in trying to persuade him? Seamus blinked. I'm not trying to persuade you. Dylan sighed deeply. In truth, he could already sense that his body was still in its growth stage. Faced with such intense study, even if his mind could handle it, his spirit and body were beginning to feel the strain. But, rest? The moment this thought came to his mind, Quirrell's face suddenly appeared in his mind again. If I don't use the 6 dark arts, with my current level of magic, I'm definitely no match for him, and if he wanted to face Quirrell, he couldn't really go one-on-one. For example, he couldn't just use an Avada Bite of the Big Melon mid-fight and sneak attack him to death. Because, this guy has 2 faces. One in front, one in the back. A sneak attack wouldn't be easy. Furthermore, while others couldn't indirectly track his magic, this was Hogwarts after all. Who knew that old man Dumbledore might be hiding somewhere, secretly observing Quirrell? And then he'd just happen to catch him making a sneak attack. Would that mean he'd be caught red-handed? So Dylan's plan was to strengthen his magical foundation as much as possible. At least in a face-to-face fight, he could still have a temporary defense without resorting to dark magic. That way, with the one's beautification function at his disposal, he could sneak in a few less obvious, max-level dark spells among the heaps of magic. Anyway, he just changed color, and he didn't show any negative emotions. Even if others saw him using a spell, it would be difficult for them to notice anything. Rest for nothing. As long as I don't die from studying, I'll study until I die. Although he didn't think Quirrell would really have any impact on him, he still had to be prepared. Even if he didn't want to participate in the plot, what if he was implicated at a critical moment? Therefore, the more preparations he could make, the better. Dylan sat down on the bench, picked up the book and wanted to continue reading. Seeing this, Neville pursed his lips, then stretched out his chubby hand and grabbed the book from Dylan's hand. Hey, Dylan. I need your help with something. Huh? Dylan was stunned. Neville closed the book. Do you remember that firethorn? The seedling Professor Sprout asked me to take care of. It was just yesterday. I ran out of the special nutrients it needs, so I have to ask Hagrid for some. but I'm a little afraid of him. Can you take me with you? Dylan blinked. Isn't Seamus here? You two don't seem to have anything else to do, so why don't you go together? Harry and Ron had been getting closer recently, and Neville had often wanted to hang out with Dylan. But he had to study every day. But after Neville melted Seamus's cauldron in potions class, they actually bonded. Neville's face flushed a little. Seamus realized what was happening and immediately shook his head. I said I was going to cheer Harry on. He has a practice match today, and Ron and his two brothers are here too. Dylan glanced at the two brats suspiciously. It was still early for the match, wasn't that a lame excuse? However, Dylan understood what they meant and smiled helplessly. In that case, I'll take you to see Hagrid and have something delicious while you're there. Neville was stunned. What delicious food? Dylan smiled. These rock pancakes made by Hagrid himself, they taste amazing. Chapter 39 The Forbidden Forest is a good place. That's fantastic. Let's go. Neville couldn't help but feel happy when he saw that he had dragged Dylan along. He was even happier to hear that there was something delicious to eat. Dylan didn't bother to pack his things, just shoved his books on the table, stood up, and prepared to go to Hagrid's hut with Neville. Moo. Cole immediately followed. Do you want to go too? Dylan smiled. Moo. Cole said crisply. Then let's go. Dylan raised his lips and opened his arms to Cole. Cole suddenly jumped up, as if turning into a shadow, and the next moment jumped into Dylan's arms. Neville looked at the furry Cole with a hint of envy. He wished he had such a cute pet. Huh? Wait a minute, I think I forgot something again. Neville stood there, blinking. Just then, Dylan, who had already walked ahead, turned and looked at him, a little puzzled. What's wrong, huh? No, nothing. Neville shook his head and hurried after him. He'd been trying his best to find topics to keep Dylan from getting bored, and Dylan kept chatting along. When the two of them and the cat arrived at Hagrid's hut, Hagrid happened to be standing at the doorway, wandering around. Seeing them, his eyes lit up. Two little wizards, why didn't you see Harry and the others today? Dylan approached. Harry had a match, and Ron went to see it too. What, a match? Oh. I can't go. What a shame. Hagrid looked regretful. But then, Dylan's messy hair caught his attention. Did you get tricked by those ghosts? No. Hagrid blinked, then lowered his brows to look at the cold rickets in Dylan's arms. Hey, little one, how are you? Are you going to play with everyone today? Cole had come over here when he'd sneaked out last time, so naturally, he knew Hagrid. He darted into Hagrid's open arms, his little paw playfully twirling his thick beard, making Hagrid laugh. Despite his size, Hagrid was quite gentle with Cole. He gently tickled Cole's chin and steered Dylan and the others inside. The room was warm, filled with the scent of wood and smoke. Hagrid let Cole hop around his spacious room as he walked to the kitchen. He brought out a plate of snacks. I just made a plate of rock pancakes today. They're fresh. Want some? Seeing the steaming pancakes before him, Neville remembered what Dylan had said about them being delicious, and nodded immediately. Please give me one. Oh, of course. Hagrid offered Neville a whole rock pancake, uncut. I'm not going to eat. I just ate, and it's still early for tea, Dylan said with a smile. All right, Hagrid nodded, then looked at Neville expectantly. Neville's eyes sparkled, and without a word, he grabbed the rock pancake in front of him and, under Dylan's equally expectant gaze, opened his mouth and bit into it. Crunch! Neville's eyes widened instantly. His mouth parted, his facial muscles contorted slightly with pain, and his expression instantly fell. Ouch! Neville instinctively covered his mouth with his hand, looking at Dylan with a mournful look. Dylan suppressed a smirk, his lips curling slightly, his shoulders shaking, and finally he burst out laughing. Ha ha ha. Actually, this is really delicious. It might just be a little hard to chew, Dylan. Neville paused, then punched Dylan in mock anger. Hagrid scratched his head. Still a little hard to chew? Well, Fang, sensing the situation, leaped over, tongue lolling out, tail wagging at Neville. Neville glanced at Hagrid. Just give it to him. He loves it, Hagrid nodded. Neville then stuffed the building material in his hand, no, the rock cake, into Fang's mouth. Dylan also stopped laughing and explained the purpose of their visit to Hagrid. Special nutrients for the firethorn. Hagrid was stunned. Did I send it to Professor Sprout? Dylan explained. The professor has some, but Neville doesn't. Professor Sprout specifically gave it to Neville to plant. We've used up the special nutrients before, and it's not easy to ask the professor for more now. I see, Hagrid understood. Firethorn is not an easy thing to care for. This little creature is very aggressive, and it requires nutrients with a special ratio to fertilize it. Otherwise, the Flamethorn might get so upset that it would combust. But Professor Sprout actually gave you a seedling like this. It seems the professor really appreciates you, Neville said shyly. It's all thanks to Dylan. Indeed, the professor had asked Neville to take care of the Flamethorn, a difficult magical plant, thanks to Dylan's request for special treatment after class. Moreover, Neville had a considerable talent for herbology. After a few rounds of this, Professor Sprout figured that since it was just one person getting special treatment, it was just another, so he agreed to Dylan's request. As a result, whenever Professor Sprout gave Dylan special treatment, Neville would also be called in. Eventually, he would lose track of the pace, staring blankly at the two of them, researching various magical plants. Despite the fast pace, though, he had made significant progress after attending so many extracurricular classes. The special nutrient for the flame thorns isn't easy to prepare. It requires quite a few ingredients. Luckily, there's plenty of fertilizer in the Forbidden Forest. If we mix them together, we can get something with similar effects. Is that okay? Of course, Neville didn't refuse. Dylan had only come here with Neville, so after the two of them started chatting, he didn't interrupt. Instead, he looked out the window. The tall trees and dense foliage of the Forbidden Forest obscured his view, making it difficult to see what was going on. The Forbidden Forest is a great place, he mused. Lately, he'd been doing quite a bit of potion research with Professor Snape. Almost every time Professor Snape gave him a little extra work, it was the ingredients he provided. Dylan couldn't afford to spend all his potion research on just one Saturday. And if he wanted to experiment with brewing potions privately, he naturally needed the ingredients. And he couldn't have the nerve to ask Professor Snape for them. Besides, the materials other people had were used to brew high-level potions, so it would be a waste for him to use them for training. So where did he get the materials? Chapter 40, Magic Wand Beautification. Pink Starlight Particles. It just so happens that while my other spells aren't particularly advanced, my mastery of the 6 dark curses at max level is enough to make me fearless of any magical creature in the Forbidden Forest. Dylan thought again of the beautification of his wand. I've already sent a good amount of money home for Dad to buy stocks. It hasn't gone sky high in the last few months, but I've made a decent profit. With that money, I can definitely get a skin from my spellcasting. Then, even if someone sees me using magic, what's the big deal? Who would believe that a wand shimmering with pink light could cast a spell that's truly the Avada? He cast a pink fluffy bunny version of the killing curse, which people might have thought was just some special effect. Besides the ingredients for potions, the rest can even be sold. Dylan wasn't particularly interested in selling ingredients from magical creatures, but it was still a profit nonetheless. If I get Harry's cloak, can I just go and rob Gringotts? Dylan couldn't imagine what kind of reward the achievement system would give him if he actually robbed Gringotts. As he pondered this, Dylan began to plan how to sneak into the Forbidden Forest and begin hunting for the various potion ingredients he needed. Hagrid chatted briefly with Neville for a while, then agreed on a time for Neville to return and collect the special nutrients. He walked Dylan and Neville to the door and then turned into the Forbidden Forest. Dylan glanced into the darkness of the Forbidden Forest before looking away. Let's go back. Dylan and Neville headed back towards Hogwarts. Neville rubbed his chubby face. Oh my god, this pancake is going to break my teeth. He turned to look at Dylan. Did you notice that just now? Dylan blinked. What? He had been thinking about how to sneak into the Forbidden Forest and do something inhumane to Hagrid's orac. That's the pancake. Hagrid just baked another batch. Huh? What happened? You didn't notice. I saw Hagrid didn't hold the tray steady, and one of the rock pancakes accidentally fell off, and Fang was right at Hagrid's feet, and that rock pancake happened to hit him on the head, knocking him unconscious. Huh? Dylan was stunned. I really didn't notice. Neville grinned. I guess Fang is used to this kind of thing. I saw it wake up after a short while. Dylan nodded. Okay, no wonder I didn't notice. I'm going to check on the Flamethorns. Hagrid just rummaged through the drawers and luckily found me a little bit of special nutrients that I can use for the time being. Dylan nodded slightly. Okay, go ahead, I'll go straight back to the dorm. Neville paused. He was about to ask Dylan if he wanted to join him, but before he could say anything, the road was blocked. He said helplessly. Then, Dylan knew Neville was worried about him. He smiled and patted the chubby boy's shoulder gently. Okay, Okay, I'll take care of myself. And I won't be studying for so long today. I'll just relax and study something else. Huh? Studying something else? Isn't that still studying? Neville looked at Dylan skeptically. No, I'm studying something more interesting, not just from the textbooks. Dylan shook his head immediately. Okay then, Neville nodded. Then I'll go to the greenhouse. Take care of yourself. I got it, Mr. Longbottom. Dylan waved. Moo. Cole waved back at Neville. See you tonight, Cole, Neville said with a cheerful smile. After they parted ways, Dylan carried Cole back to the dormitory. Seamus was gone. Dylan took off his shoes, climbed onto the bed, and lay down on his back. He tossed Cole aside. He pulled out his wand and examined it carefully. The wand was jet black, emitting a cool luster. Mysterious spells seemed to flow faintly through the wood grain. But upon closer inspection, it seemed nothing at all. There's no need for a skin, right? I think the wand looks pretty cool the way it is now, and I don't need to hide my identity. I just have to transform it into something different. Dylan felt the coolness of the wand against his fingertips. He tapped the tip with his index finger. Any ideas? Do you want a pink effect or a colorful one when casting? The wand didn't move. If you don't say anything, I'll assume you like both, Dylan thought for a moment, glancing at his current money column. Besides the money I'll keep my parents running the business, I still have over 10,000 galleons. It's only 100, not too much. Dylan had an idea. He clicked on the wand icon on the dashboard, and then the wand customization section opened. After a moment's hesitation, a sinister idea suddenly struck Dylan. How about adding a pink starlight particle effect? Just then, a system prompt popped up. Message, yes no, spend 300 gold coins to add a pink starlight particle effect to the wand's attack effect? What? 300? Dylan was stunned. Wasn't it agreed that the change would only cost 100 gold coins? He stared at the system prompt for a moment. Dylan seemed to understand. So, just add one pink attack effect. Sure enough, the moment Dylan changed his request, the system prompt also changed. Message, yes no, spend 100 gold coins to add a pink effect to the wand's attack effect? Dylan smacked his lips. Pink, starlight, particles, that's 3 effects? Not to mention the one-time fee for the color. Shouldn't the starlight particles be a single effect? Never mind, I've already paid anyway, it's just another 200 gold coins. Message, yes no, spend 300 gold coins. Dylan simply clicked yes. The next moment, Dylan felt something strange happening to his wand. Buzz, suddenly, the wand began to vibrate violently. Dylan felt as if a mysterious, almost intangible, magical power descended upon the wand in his hand. The whole process was swift, and the wand was transformed. Dylan poked his head out from under the covers and glanced at the door. No one was there. Let me try. Dylan waved his wand impatiently. In an instant, something completely different from his previous wand swings occurred. In the path of the wand's swing, an unprecedented pink starlight particle effect poured out like a dreamy waterfall. Chapter 41 Halloween, is this going to force the plot to stop? Moo. Cole Ball, standing nearby, jumped in surprise. Its dark eyes fixed on the fleeting pink starlight. Dylan was also a little surprised. Looks like the money was well spent. Dylan waved his wand again. Loomis, swish, a brilliant, soft pink light dispelled the gloom from the room. Dots of tiny particles shimmered with a captivating glow, intertwining and colliding, each contact releasing bursts of pink starlight. Moo. Cole Ball charged directly towards the pink starlight. However, it missed. Moo. Dylan suddenly discovered a new amusement. He waved his wand again. Swish, pink starlight suddenly appeared. Cole Ball lunged forward again. Hey. Interesting, he hadn't expected that by embellishing his wand, he could actually transform it into a cat toy. Dylan played tirelessly with Cole Ball for almost the entire afternoon. Only when he heard the clatter of footsteps and chatter outside, evidently a number of young wizards returning to their dormitories, did Dylan pause. Who? Dylan let out a breath, looking at the tired Cole Ball with a doting smile. He reached out and gently scratched Cole Ball's chin. Cole Ball narrowed its eyes in pleasure, making a huff sound in its throat, and nuzzled its head against Dylan's hand. Dylan burst into laughter at its adorable antics. Although they had been playing for a long time today, Dylan didn't feel it was a waste of time. On the contrary, re-examining his own state of mind, Dylan was pleasantly surprised to find that the accumulated stress within him had dissipated, a surge of joy filling his heart, and his tired body felt much more relaxed. Although dinner always relieves some stress, I can't overeat. After playing with Colball this afternoon, unexpectedly, the accumulated stress had completely dissipated. Nothing to do today, let's get a good night's sleep. Recharge for the fighting tomorrow. Dylan went to eat first, then returned to his dorm, where he fell into deep sleep. In the evening, when Harry, Ron, and the others returned, they were chatting when they saw Dylan sleeping soundly. They all exchanged glances, a bit surprised, but at the same time, they all involuntarily slowed down their movements. The smell of roasted pumpkin. It was another early morning. Dylan had just finished washing up and walked out the door when he was hit by a rich aroma. Halloween. Dylan rarely paid attention to any holidays, but the smell of pumpkin reminded him that today was Halloween. I remember it was at the Halloween dinner when a troll appeared out of nowhere, Dylan pondered as he walked to the owlery, his small backpack slung over his shoulder. No, that troll seemed to have been released by Quirrell. Dylan's memory was a little hazy. He only vaguely remembered that Harry and the others had sneaked into the women's restroom and encountered the troll. What impressed him most was how easily they defeated it with the levitation charm they had just learned. Trolls aren't common. Not only are there few of them, but their teeth can enhance the potency of potions, their livers can be used to make potions that cure serious illnesses or curses, their mucus also has unique magical properties, making it ideal for medicinal use. Dylan went to the owlery, fed Luna some food, and slipped it a letter he wanted to send to his parents. Then he went to the Great Hall to have breakfast. Well, I can't kill the three-headed dog, but I can at least kill it, right? The three-headed dog was obviously stationed in a restricted area at Hogwarts. He wouldn't bother with it. But this troll. Dylan was just about to start researching a new potion. If he could gather the ingredients from this troll, he wouldn't have to worry about searching for it again. A full day of classes passed. Hogwarts students flocked to the Great Hall for the Halloween dinner. Dylan joined the crowd. When he approached Harry and Ron, he noticed that Ron looked a little unwell. Dylan blinked, then whispered to Harry, "Is Ron feeling unwell?" Harry glanced at Ron, who seemed preoccupied, and pursed his lips. "Did you do well in charms class this morning? You performed the levitation charm brilliantly, so." Dylan tilted his head. "So." Harry paused, then glanced at Ron again. After Professor Flitwick called Hermione up to practice the levitation charm again, and because Hermione wasn't performing as well as you, he sneakily said something bad about her, and then, hearing this, Dylan roughly understood what had happened. He was the focus of the professor's attention during class. Throughout the entire class, whenever they could interact with students, they would almost always choose to talk to him. Therefore, he hadn't paid much attention to what was going on with Harry. But after hearing what Harry said, Dylan said with some resignation, and just as he said something bad, Hermione caught him again. Harry nodded gravely. Greek letter iota. Dylan really didn't understand why Ron loved to talk bad about people behind their backs. The thing is, you can just say it, but you're so sneaky about it, and every time you get caught red-handed. It's truly outrageous. Actually, Ron hasn't said anything bad about Hermione in a while, but this time, Hermione feels like Ron doesn't even consider her a friend. Harry blinked. And she thinks Ron must have said a lot of bad things about her behind her back. Dylan smacked his lips. For a moment, he was speechless. So what happened then? What's going on now? Hermione started crying in the second half of the class, and I haven't seen her the whole afternoon. Is this going straight into the plot? Dylan had been thinking about sneaking into the bathroom, secretly dealing with a troll, secretly decomposing the materials, and doing all this secretly. Unexpectedly, Ron happened to anger Hermione and sent her to the bathroom again? Who knew that girls could be so troublesome? I told you, I was just joking. And she just didn't act as good as Dylan, did she? Ron said with all his strength. But you also said she was pretentious, Harry added. Am I wrong? Ron glared. Although I didn't practice the spell well today, she wouldn't keep lecturing me, so this is the cause. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 42 Dylan, you. Dylan was speechless at the sight of these little brats. He couldn't help but think back to when he was little, wondering if he'd been just like Ron and the others, prone to quarreling. After a brief thought, he shook his head. That time was so long ago, he'd already lived through 2 lifetimes, and he couldn't remember it. A group of people had just arrived at the Great Hall. Before they could even sit down, Quirrell suddenly threw open the door and rushed in with a look of terror on his face. Troll. In the dungeon, troll, there's a troll. Dylan was eating lamb chops. He didn't react to Quirrell's appearance. But Harry, standing next to him, nearly had his throat choked by the mashed potatoes in his hand. Ahem, Dylan handed him a glass of milk. Harry gave Dylan a grateful look, then gulped it down until he calmed down. The young wizards around them, who had been so cheerful, were now terrified, some screaming uncontrollably. The senior students, though somewhat calmer, were also startled. They all stood up, frantically searching for their wands. For a moment, the entire hall was in chaos. But no one paid any attention to Quirrell, who had already fallen to the ground. Calm down. Suddenly, a purple firework exploded from the ceiling of the hall. Old Dumbledore's resounding voice drowned out the screams. Wow, that's a perfect use of the raising charm. Dylan had also learned the raising charm. In fact, he had briefly studied many spells. It wasn't that he wanted to learn too much, but because he already had the 6 dark spells at full level, he could easily apply many magical principles. This allowed him to learn many spells easily without much effort. As a result, even if he didn't expect to master these spells to full or advanced level immediately, he would at least have a proficiency of 1 to 4 levels. This would almost be equivalent to mastering a new spell. So Dylan's motto was, regardless of his proficiency, to learn it first. Knowing something was better than not knowing anything. As for how much he knew, that was something he would figure out later. Don't say jack of all trades, master of none. The obvious answer was master of all trades, master of everything. Furthermore, spells often share similarities. If he learned one, perhaps he'd be inspired by another, leading to a significant improvement in his proficiency. All prefects, take your students back to their dormitories. Old Dumbledore's voice echoed throughout the hall. Harry and Ron exchanged glances, their expressions unsatisfactory, clearly thinking of Hermione. Dylan took the opportunity to study old Dumbledore's control of the voice booster charm. This proficiency must be at least level 8, right? The sound is not only magnificent, but also so rich and pleasant, without a trace of noise or harshness. At this moment, Ron's older brother Percy was walking back and forth among the first-year Gryffindor wizards. Quick, stop eating, you. Hey, I'm talking to you. Put down the witchcraft worm puff and catch up with the group. And you, what are you eating? Screaming pickled tongue snails? That's too spicy, you're too young to eat that. Get up and follow me. Percy quickly left the hall with the first-year Gryffindor wizards. Halfway through, Harry and Ron joined together and squeezed towards Dylan. The 2 men looked worried and looked at Dylan together. There is a troll in the school? Oh my god, this is unbelievable. And Hermione didn't come to the dinner just now. Could she not know about the troll? Dylan paused. She probably doesn't know. Isn't this nonsense? They just learned about the news of the troll. How would Hermione know? Huh? Harry stared. Ron was also a little panicked, and didn't care about being awkward anymore. Then should we go look for her? Dylan's eyes moved. In fact, if he went directly to find the troll now, he would most likely run into other professors. But if he wanted to follow Harry and the others, forget it. Then use Avada Kedavra as a fragment to be torn into pieces. He had already changed his attack effects into pink starlight particles, let alone letting Harry and other little wizards see his spellcasting process. Even if a professor came over, he might not be able to determine what spell he used. Moreover, he would not leave any traces when using dark magic. Even if Harry witnessed the fact that he killed the troll and reported it to Professor McGonagall and others would not be able to determine what spell he used. We must find Hermione, Harry said firmly. Then what are we waiting for? Let's sneak away from the team. Ron grabbed Harry and Dylan's hands. Dylan, I haven't said whether I want to go together or not. Thinking about the materials on the troll. Dylan still took the opportunity to go with Ron, bent down, and sneaked out of the team. It's a pity that my system doesn't give me the function of taming pets, just as Dylan sighed. Harry's voice rang out, go over there. Where's that? Dylan asked. I don't know. Harry looked alert, looking around, and rushed around with Ron and Dylan. He didn't know what was going on. Ah, there's someone. Get out of the way. Harry passed a corner, rushed out, and immediately retreated, dragging Dylan into the shadows of the corner. Ron also rushed in. His movements were so smooth, it was obvious that the two of them weren't already familiar with this kind of thing. Dylan smacked his lips. Then, he saw a large black robe quickly floating in the corridor outside. It looks like Professor Snape. Harry and the others left, secretly poking half of his head out. Where should we go to find Hermione now? Ron lowered his voice, his eyes dodging. I think he heard that Hermione has been hiding in the bathroom crying. Then let's go and see. Dylan waited until the noise outside died down, then pulled out his wand. Disillusionment Charm. The Disillusionment Charm is a high-level spell, and Dylan's current proficiency is level 5. Although unlike Old Man Dumbledore and Voldemort, who don't need the help of an invisibility cloak, they can achieve complete invisibility with just the Disillusionment Charm. It's more than enough to fool some small wizards. A pink starlight particle special effect flashed by. Harry and Ron were stunned. Dylan, you. Chapter 43 The pink furry rabbit killed the giant monster. Speckles of pink light, like tiny, shimmering gemstones, spread rapidly towards Dylan and the two people beside him, as if summoned. Then, within the streamy, pink halo, their figures gradually blurred, their once distinct outlines slowly fading silently into the surroundings. This is my newly developed wand flash charm. This special effect makes my spells even more powerful. Dylan wasn't lying. He'd noticed that when he didn't activate these special effects while casting spells, he always felt something was missing. But whenever he didn't deliberately suppress the pink starlight particles, his spells felt incredibly smooth, and the power of his spells increased slightly. Dylan suspected this was a hidden, cosmetic effect of the wand. After all, while the system only stated that a wand reskin could be reapplied for a fee of galleons, it didn't mention that the spell wouldn't also see a slight increase in power after the reskin was applied. It was precisely because of this discovery that Dylan felt like pouring all his money into the beautification of his wand. However, he was also worried that the beautification of the wand would be too exaggerated, and that he would be questioned by the professors when discussing issues with him. So Dylan planned to wait until a short break, or during the winter or summer holidays, when he could study spells alone, to try more with the galleons. Oh my god, Ron looked at his hand, which had seemingly vanished, in shock. Dylan could even perform such an advanced spell? Were we all really first-year Hogwarts students? Harry poked his head out and looked up the hallway. It seems like Professor Snape just walked by. He was heading, probably to the 4th floor. Harry seemed hesitant. What on earth is Professor Snape going to on the 4th floor? Dylan glanced up. If he had a chance to get the Philosopher's Stone. I'd like to go up and take a look, Harry suddenly said. Huh? Dylan was surprised. Really? Aren't you worried about Hermione encountering the troll again? Harry paused. Well, if Professor Snape were to do something this dangerous, he'd definitely skin you alive. Dylan didn't want to waste any more time, so he walked forward, saying, I'm not proficient enough with this spell yet. The disillusionment charm could wear off at any moment. We have to hurry. Ron glanced at Dylan, then at his nearly transparent hands. Not high enough. What did I mean? He pouted. Maybe Hermione was right. The two quickly followed Dylan. The three of them walked into the classroom corridor. Dylan frowned. What a terrible smell. A pungent, sickening smell tugged at his nose hairs and penetrated his nasal cavity. Charm. Another flash of pink starlight particles passed, and Dylan's head was enveloped in a circle of transparent bubbles. A foul odor also emanated from the bubbles. Hey! What kind of spell is this? Ron's eyes widened. I just told you its name. Dylan rushed directly into the girls' bathroom. A massive, hideous troll stood with its back to him. Its bulky form slowly inched forward from stall to stall, its massive nose occasionally nudging the edge, sniffing the air inside as if searching for something. Dylan's eyes narrowed. The noise of Dylan's ramming the bathroom door open startled the troll, and its slow movements faltered. It spun around, its large, doe-like eyes widening upon seeing Dylan. Roar, you're calling your mother. Dylan swung his wand without hesitation. Crucio. Suddenly, a brilliant shower of pink starlight erupted from the tip of his wand, and in the blink of an eye, it was in front of the troll. The pink starlight instantly enveloped the troll's massive form. As the pink starlight particles penetrated the troll's body, its furious expression froze, then twisted into a contorted, agonizing wail. Ouch! The troll's massive limbs began flailing uncontrollably, punching itself in the chest again and again, trying to escape the excruciating pain. Harry and Ron had rushed behind Dylan, and upon seeing the troll's appearance, both were shocked. "What kind of spell is that, Incendio?" Dylan mumbled. Then, before the troll could recover, he raised his wand again and shouted, "Incendio!" He silently chanted, "Fiend Fire Curse," as one of the 6 dark arts he had mastered. The Fiend Fire Curse didn't require a wand at all, he could cast it without it. Furthermore, he didn't need to pronounce the spell aloud. Therefore, Harry and Ron only heard Dylan's cry of Incendio. The next moment, Dylan's wand erupted into a shower of dazzling pink starlight particles. As if imbued with life, the particles rapidly converged and swirled, transforming in the blink of an eye into a pink fluffy rabbit. Squeak! The crackle of flames echoed. The pink rabbit's body was ablaze, its ears erect, its ruby eyes gleaming with an eerie light, its mouth gaping, revealing sharp, flaming fangs. The troll was startled by the sudden appearance of the pink flaming rabbit. His heart was pounding. The rabbit had already lunged at him. A look of human-like terror crossed the troll's face. Boom! The pink flaming rabbit bit into the troll's neck, clinging to it tightly. The flames, transformed from pink starlight particles, continuously seared the troll's skin, sizzling. The smell of scorching flesh mingled with the troll's stench. Harry and Ron, who lacked the bubbles in Dylan's head, felt their Adam's apples well up at the smell and turned their heads to vomit. Ugh! Dylan's eyes flickered. Incendio, Avada Kedavra. Dylan's wand tip shot out another pink fluffy rabbit, but this one was much smaller and cuter. It was incredibly fast. Before Harry and Ron had even finished vomiting, it had already soared to the troll's shoulder. Squeak! The pink, starlit fluffy rabbit tilted its head, then kicked out with its legs, piercing the troll's brain. Roar! The troll's screams abruptly stopped. Its movements froze, its eyes drained of life, and its vitality drained away like a tide. Boom! Its massive body collapsed to the ground, shaking the entire bathroom 3 times. At that moment, Ron finally came to his senses, wiped his mouth with one hand, and stared. Oh my god, the pink fluffy rabbit killed the troll. Chapter 44 Professor Snape, are you guarding the Philosopher's Stone? It's dead already. Harry finished vomiting and turned to see the troll lying motionless on the ground, a look of bewilderment on his face. Isn't it playing dead? I heard these monsters are cunning, maybe other monsters are like that, but not trolls, Dylan said flatly. This was Dylan's first time using dark magic properly, and the feeling of exerting magical power was intoxicating. Although his current magical power meant that even with a full-level spell mastery, he still couldn't unleash the true power of dark magic. Yet, even so, he easily unleashed 3 spells and dispatched the troll. By Voldemort, dark magic is truly powerful. Dylan walked forward, pushing open the doors of each compartment one by one. In the 3rd compartment, Dylan found Hermione, already unconscious. Enervate, pink starlight particles shot out from the tip of Dylan's wand, covering Hermione as she leaned against the door. After a moment, Hermione's eyelashes fluttered slightly, and then she slowly opened her eyes. Consciousness gradually cleared, and she saw Dylan standing at the door of the compartment, and 2 heads jutting out from either side. Have I been in heaven? Don't worry, Miss Granger. With the venomous image Ron has created of you, you'll probably go to hell after you die, Hermione. Hey. Dylan, you, how can you say that? The head on the left suddenly tilted up, glaring at Dylan. The head on the right, wearing black-framed glasses, also tilted its head up. Dylan's right, aren't you going to apologize, Ron? Ron's cheeks flushed, and his eyes flickered to the still-dazed Hermione. Soon, Hermione finally regained consciousness. She pushed herself to her feet and said, "Why are you here?" "Hide. I just encountered a troll," Harry immediately said. "Don't worry, Dylan's already dealt with that troll." "What?" Hermione was stunned. At that moment, Ron's face, red as a monkey's bottom, finally relaxed. He muttered to Hermione, "I'm sorry about what happened this morning." Hermione was stunned again. Having just experienced a life-or-death chase with a troll, she didn't feel anything about Ron's apology. "Wait here for a moment. I'll go up and see if there are any professors." Dylan, seeing that Hermione was fine, just frightened, comforted her briefly and asked Harry and Ron to take care of her. He then left the dungeon. Because he had killed the troll so quickly, no one outside had noticed a battle had taken place. He went up 2 floors and didn't see any professors. "Are they all on the 4th floor?" A troll had suddenly rushed into the school, and with Professor Snape, who they had encountered on the way, rushing to the 4th floor, Dylan guessed that many professors must have been away protecting the Philosopher's Stone. Sure enough, as he turned the corner on the 4th floor, a deep, scolding voice suddenly rang out. "Who's there?" Dylan stepped forward. "Wait a minute, Professor. Don't use your skills." Professor Snape, dressed in a black robe, was startled upon seeing Dylan. His expression darkened, and his thick black eyebrows knitted together like two entangled black snakes. A pair of cold, sharp eyes shot out from beneath his brows. "You're not in the dormitory at this time, and you actually come here? Oh, that's really..." Dylan sighed deeply and was about to say something, but he saw Professor Snape's impatience and increasingly tense and stern expression. He immediately changed his tone. "I really have to make it short. Hermione disappeared today. After hearing about the troll, Harry dragged Ron and me along to look for her, then we happened to run into you on the way, but we were looking for Hermione so we didn't say hello, Professor. Then, we ran all the way to the dungeon bathroom and happened to encounter that troll trying to hurt Hermione, then I set it on fire and killed it. So, I wanted to come out and talk to Professor about this, but I didn't run into any professors along the way. I thought you were on the 4th floor, so I had no choice but to come here first." As Dylan continued to talk, Professor Snape's hawk-like eyes widened instantly, and a rare flicker of obvious shock flashed in his black pupils. "What did you say, huh?" Dylan paused. "Should I tell you again, Professor?" Snape's thin lips were pressed into a straight line, his gaze fixed on Dylan. "You said you killed that troll." His brow furrowed, the corners of his mouth curling slightly, as if he were judging Dylan's words. "Yes," Dylan nodded, then glanced at Professor Snape's expression and suddenly broke into an innocent smile. "Well, Professor, after all, I was the one who discovered that troll, and I was the one who dealt with it. The materials from it." Snape's black pupils trembled even more. What on earth had he heard? A first-year wizard dealt with a troll, and not only was he not afraid at all, he even came to him to claim the credit, asking for the troll's body as materials? "How did you kill the troll, Professor?" "Didn't I just say I burned it to death with a blazing flame?" Dylan answered honestly. "Of course, it could have been torn into pieces, but its body was so charred that I couldn't tell." Professor Snape's brow furrowed, his cold gaze raking Dylan up and down. Dylan glanced behind Snape. "Professor, are you guarding the Philosopher's Stone?" Professor Snape's cold, deep eyes widened again, and he was shocked again. "You?" He opened his thin lips slightly, wanting to say something, but the words were choked in his throat. A few strands of greasy black hair fell from his forehead, causing his usually tense facial lines to relax a little, revealing a rare moment of loss of composure. "How did you know about the Philosopher's Stone?" Dylan blinked. It was Harry. Wasn't it Harry and Hagrid who went to Gringotts to get the Philosopher's Stone? He was chased here by Peeves last time. Oh, and he also said he met a three-headed dog. Professor Snape's eyes narrowed instantly. Harry? A three-headed dog? He felt his eyelids twitch wildly twice. That reckless, stupid, damn Potter. Professor Snape suddenly turned and strode forward, his steps hurried and heavy, his black robe swung aside with a rustle. "Let's go to the dungeon." Chapter 45. Hey, old guy Snape. Did Hagrid tell you about the Philosopher's Stone? A deep voice drifted from the front. Dylan shook his head. I guess based on some details Harry told me. Of course, when I went to see Hagrid a while ago, he accidentally let something slip, which confirmed it was the Philosopher's Stone. The last time Neville dragged him to see Hagrid, after Hagrid prepared the special nutrients for the Flamithorns, they went back to Hagrid's hut. While Neville went to get the nutrients, he chatted with Hagrid, and Hagrid had accidentally let him know something. That guy, Professor Snape said in a gloomy voice. It's not his fault. I guess he's worried about the Philosopher's Stone being stolen, which has kept him awake lately. He's been suffering from insomnia, so he let it slip, Dylan added on Hagrid's behalf. The reason he brought up the Philosopher's Stone directly with Snape was partly because Hagrid had let him know earlier. Although he hadn't fully revealed the Philosopher's Stone, Hagrid stopped mid-sentence. But combined with Harry's description, anyone who heard it could easily conclude that what Hagrid had taken from Gringotts was the Philosopher's Stone. He revealed the matter directly to Snape to avoid Dumbledore's subsequent trouble. He didn't want to have to deal with Dumbledore any further. Secondly, he wasn't deliberately trying to trick Harry. Dylan suspected that Dumbledore was most likely behind all this. Even if not, he was certainly aware of Harry's recent activities. Therefore, even if he used the flaming flames to conceal his dark magic, Dumbledore was likely watching Harry's actions. He wanted to stay out of the situation completely, and it would be best to tell a professor what he had heard. Professor Snape was clearly the perfect fit for this role. He wanted to portray himself as a first-year wizard who, despite knowing about the Philosopher's Stone, was unconcerned with it and had no ulterior motives, simply a devoted, honest, and reliable first year. In fact, Dylan did have some thoughts on the Philosopher's Stone. However, he wasn't seeking to achieve immortality through the Philosopher's Stone, he was instead interested in using it for research. In this world, other ways to extend lifespan included drinking unicorn blood and forging Horcruxes, in addition to the Philosopher's Stone. However, none of these methods were reliable. The Philosopher's Stone could extend lifespan, but it couldn't prevent the body from aging. Unicorn blood cursed those who drank it. And Horcruxes, the side effects were even more numerous. Either the soul would be damaged, or emotions and psychology would gradually become distorted. The consequences for those who sought to defy the laws of nature through deviant means were obvious. However, Nicholas Flamel was able to independently develop the Philosopher's Stone, and his ultimate fate was, after all, far better than that of Voldemort and Hercule. Now that the Philosopher's Stone had been developed, even though it wouldn't protect against aging, what if the results could lead to even greater advancements? Magic, like scientific research, is like hard work. With effort, progress is always possible. Professor Snape led Dylan down the stairs, but encountered two people halfway. Dylan, Professor McGonagall and Quirrell stood in front of Snape and Dylan. Professor McGonagall stared at Dylan, a bit stunned. Dylan opened his mouth, about to say something. But Professor Snape suddenly said, "He used my potion to kill a troll." Dylan was a bit surprised, but he glanced at Professor Snape, who remained calm. "Hey, that old guy what?" Professor McGonagall paused, her face filled with shock, her wrinkles smoothing out. "You killed a troll? Where?" Dylan glanced at Quirrell, then pointed to the dungeon up ahead. "Over there, in the bathroom. Harry and the others are there too." "What?" Professor McGonagall glared, then hurried towards the dungeon. She went straight to the girls' bathroom. There she saw a young wizard with a dazed look on his face, standing awkwardly to the side, apologizing to another young wizard. "I know what I said was harsh. I'm sorry, Hermione." The moment Ron finished speaking, the three of them immediately noticed Professor McGonagall, who had rushed in from the doorway. They were about to greet her, but Professor Snape also walked in with a sullen expression. Harry, Ron, and the others immediately shrank back, lowering their heads slightly. "How dare you?" Professor McGonagall frowned, glancing at the troll lying beside the cubicle. The troll's once ferocious form was now charred beyond recognition by the flames, its limbs stretched out in a twisted position. Its essential features were charred and blurred, leaving only two black eyes lying on the ground, staring at them. "Oh my God, is this all caused by Professor Snape's potion, Dylan?" Professor McGonagall turned and looked at Dylan, who was slowly approaching from the doorway. "What, potion?" Ron was stunned. Just as he was about to say something, Hermione next to him twisted the soft flesh on his arm. Hiss. Ron's eyes widened, but he didn't dare say a word. Dylan nodded. "Besides that, my fire charm also made an outstanding contribution." Snape took 2 steps forward, took out a handkerchief, covered his nose with it, and looked at the troll below him. After a long moment, he narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. Instead, he turned to look at Harry. "I heard that you brought Hawkwood and Mr. Weasley here." Harry blinked, but didn't answer for a moment, instead casting his gaze on Dylan. Dylan stood obediently by, his eyes and nose in concern. Harry pursed his lips. "Yes, very well, Mr. Potter, your recklessness nearly caused disaster. For that, 20 points from Gryffindor." Harry opened his mouth. "But, we came here to find Hermione. Your classmate is missing. You didn't tell the professor, you took your own risks, and you even talked back." 10 more points from Gryffindor. Professor Snape's voice grew sterner. "If you have any further objections, I would suggest to Professor McGonagall that you have detention." "I don't mind personally, Professor Snape. I know what Harry did was wrong, and I will discipline him." Professor McGonagall suddenly interrupted Snape. Snape then glanced at Harry coldly, but said nothing more. Professor McGonagall looked back at Harry, a warning in her eyes. Harry finally shut up completely, lowered his head, and glanced at Dylan out of the corner of his eye. No, why was he the only one being scolded? There were so many people who came with him. Chapter 46, You created a new spell? This troll, Professor Snape's voice boomed. He glanced at Dylan, who was blinking at him expectantly. "I'll give you the ingredients I can produce when the time comes." Dylan immediately smiled and said, "Okay, Professor." He didn't even need to do it himself. Professor Snape had already arranged how to remove the ingredients from the troll. Snape glanced at the troll's corpse and said, "A powerful fire charm." Dylan smiled modestly. "But you burned off its beard and snot. Next time, it's best not to use that kind of spell." Dylan's smile froze. What did Professor Snape mean by that? Was he just trying to teach him not to burn the potion's ingredients next time? Or, did he sense something was amiss? Dylan glanced at the troll's corpse. Logically, with a buff, it was impossible for others to detect any trace of dark magic. Professor Snape shouldn't have noticed anything. Dylan even considered the burning effects of both the fiery blaze and the fiery flame. After all, with a full-level fiery flame, he could precisely control the marks left by the fiery flame on the troll's body. This would prevent anyone with a passing knowledge of the dark arts from immediately recognizing the burns from the fiery flame, not the fiery flame. Calm down, Dylan, don't be afraid. Even if someone could guess you knew the fiery flame, who could guess you knew the Avadar? Anyone who dared to question you. Dylan's thoughts were wandering when he felt Professor Snape's gaze. He immediately stopped his thoughts. He had almost forgotten that Professor Snape was a master of the incarnation. Even if he didn't cast a spell on him personally, he could definitely sense the thoughts and emotions emanating from his mind. "Alright, now go back and get some rest," Professor McGonagall suddenly said. Professor Snape tore his gaze from Dylan, then glared at Harry before tossing his black robes and storming out the door. Harry rubbed his nose, somewhat baffled. Why was this person always picking on him? Dylan had noticed this, too. It looked like someone was about to be in big trouble. "But it has nothing to do with me." Dylan looked up. "Then I'll take my leave, Professor McGonagall." He smiled and gestured to Professor McGonagall. Then he led Harry and the others out the door. Quirrell stood beside Professor McGonagall, silently watching Dylan's retreating figure, his eyes flickering slightly. Dylan was also a master of the soul mastery. Even though he couldn't see behind him, he could still sense a bright, probing gaze directed at him. "Voldemort, by God, and on my face," Dylan, while dealing with the excited inquiries of Harry and Ron beside him, pondered to himself. Quirrell is possessed by Voldemort. Are both of them able to control the body simultaneously, or is it just Quirrell who has consciousness, while Voldemort has fallen silent? This guy seemed to have noticed him now. Well, if he really intends to do something to me, I will definitely let Voldemort feel what Cruciatus feels like. Back in the dorm, Dylan continued reading, seemingly unaffected. Harry accompanied Ron and Hermione to continue apologizing. Seamus and Neville, who were in the dorm, breathed a sigh of relief to see the three finally return and were about to ask something. However, upon seeing Dylan enter, he pulled out a book and began reading with relish. They exchanged a glance and went out to find Harry and the others. As November arrived, the weather grew colder. Even the Black Lake was covered in a thick layer of ice. Dylan even saw some young wizards skating on it, but they were quickly driven away. One morning, Dylan was checking out Luna and noticed that the little one was also curled up lazily, unwilling to interact with him. "Oh, what a shame. I bought some ferret meat strips, but since no owls want to eat them, I'll just feed them to Cole." Chirp. Luna, who had been tucked into her wings and neck, suddenly popped her head out, ears perked high, eyes wide open, staring intently at Dylan. "You little glutton," Dylan scolded with a laugh, then fed her a few ferret meat strips and headed to the Great Hall, planning to eat and then attend Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration class. The troll incident didn't cause much of a stir at Hogwarts. It seemed as if it had been deliberately suppressed. However, a few days after Halloween, Dylan received potion ingredients from Professor Snape. And it wasn't just ingredients from the troll. Professor Snape had also stuffed his package with a host of other goodies. Some of the potion ingredients were practically impossible to come by, even with money. This only made Dylan's admiration for Professor Snape grow. Even his greasy hair looked so fresh. If anyone dared to say that Professor Snape didn't wash his hair, he would have jumped out and scolded them harshly. What? The professor's hair was just a unique style. A wizard style. After a day of classes, Dylan once again sat next to Professor McGonagall. He waited for Professor McGonagall to finish tutoring him. Dylan sat down but didn't leave immediately. "Professor, thank you very much for your guidance. It has given me a deeper understanding of transfiguration spells." He apologized sincerely to Professor McGonagall. Professor McGonagall looked at the clever young wizard before her, her eyes revealing a look of satisfaction and relief. It's my responsibility to cultivate talents for Hogwarts. You don't have to thank me for anything. Dylan smiled and drew his wand. He wasn't going to give Professor McGonagall a slap on the wrist, but to demonstrate his latest research spell. Oh? You actually created a new spell? Professor McGonagall was a bit surprised after hearing Dylan's explanation, but her eyes lit up with anticipation. It's not really a creation, it's more of an innovation. Dylan took out his water cup and placed it on the table. Would you like some tea? Or milk? Professor McGonagall winked. Give me some tea. Dylan nodded and waved his wand. Lactea repleta, milk tea, refill. Dots of pink starlight flashed by. A rich milky aroma, accompanied by a faint tea fragrance, wafted out. The tip of the wand was like an enchanted spring. Sizzle. The milk tea arced and poured precisely into the cups in front of them. Soon, the cups were full. Please, Dylan chuckled. Very nice magic. Professor McGonagall nodded, then glanced at the cup on the table. But you don't want me to taste it from your personal cup, do you? Chapter 47 Quidditch Match. Dylan's eyelashes fluttered, nearly giving Professor McGonagall a cold. Reflecting on his actions, he scratched his head awkwardly and chuckled. Professor McGonagall chuckled softly as well. With a flick of her wand, the cup of water beside her moved towards her. One more time, please, Lactea repleta, a sizzle. The cup quickly filled with milk tea, its rich aroma filling the air. Professor McGonagall reached out and examined the magical drink for a moment. Then she looked up at Dylan. Is this tea, milk tea? Dylan smiled. Professor McGonagall realized what was happening. So whether I want tea or milk, you'll give me this, Dylan nodded. Professor, you're so clever. Professor McGonagall chuckled, shook her head, and then swirled the cup. A layer of fine foam floated on the surface of the milk tea, its color alluring. Taking in the aroma, Professor McGonagall took a sip. Suddenly, her eyes widened slightly, as if she was somewhat surprised by the taste of the milk tea. It's smooth, with just the right amount of sweetness, and a lovely tea aroma. Professor McGonagall's eyes flickered with approval. Although it's a product of magic, it tastes quite good, Mr. Hawkwood. It seems you've made some very interesting discoveries in your study of spells. Dylan's eyes lit up at Professor McGonagall's praise. Oh, I'm glad you like it, Professor. He also took a sip from the milk tea in front of him. Summoning is a branch of transfiguration. While studying transfiguration, I stumbled upon a new discovery about summoning. This led to this little experiment, and I didn't expect it to be so successful. Professor McGonagall took another sip, then set her cup down. She looked at Dylan with a gentle and kind gaze, her lips curling up slightly in a rare smile. If I'm not mistaken, this should be a variation of clear water like a spring, right? Dylan nodded gently. I did take some reference. That can actually be considered as creating a new spell. I'm surprised you've managed to do that. Professor McGonagall smiled, then suddenly changed the subject. But researching spells is very dangerous. If you want to create a new spell in the future, you can come to me and I'll give you some reference. Is that too much trouble for you, Professor? Dylan said shyly, feeling secretly pleased. It's okay. I haven't seen such a creative spell in a long time. Professor McGonagall looked at Dylan. The same goes for the young wizard, Dylan chuckled. Regarding this spell, I just adjusted its sweetness and flavor. I'm researching how to create the toppings directly. Otherwise, this wouldn't be real milk tea. Don't worry about that, Dylan. I just happen to have something to ask you, Professor McGonagall said. What's up, Professor? Dylan's heart skipped a beat, but his expression only betrayed a hint of confusion. About a Quidditch match, Professor McGonagall said. Huh? Dylan breathed a sigh of relief, then blinked. Quidditch? What's going on? Someone had leaked the news of Harry joining the Quidditch team, driving Wood completely insane. Harry was the secret player he'd carefully groomed, waiting for the match to soar to the sky, and now the secret had been revealed. The match starts in 2 days. Are you interested in joining the Gryffindor Quidditch team? Dylan was stunned. Me? Professor, why would you ask that? My flying grades aren't great. Professor McGonagall sat up straight. Don't try to hide it from me. I'll be standing here watching during your flying lessons, and I've noticed it's not that you can't fly, you're just playing it safe. As soon as Professor McGonagall said this, Dylan knew his lack of flying skills had been discovered. You're so kind. Dylan rubbed his nose. Professor McGonagall smiled. My knowledge of flying is just as good as Madam Hooch's. Dylan thought about it, and it seemed quite right. Professor McGonagall was a longtime Quidditch fan. Her knowledge of flying might be as profound as her knowledge of transfiguration. I can sense that while your research on spells may seem radical, you're actually very steady. And when you fly, you're so steady, as if you're afraid of falling. This shows that your fundamentals are very solid. Dylan twitched his lips. He took it as Professor McGonagall's compliment. Indeed, he could fly at breakneck speeds. Yet, he instinctively wanted to perfectly control even the slightest possibility of error in his flight. It wasn't that he was afraid of death, but rather that he was meticulous and steady in his work. Thank you for the compliment, but I have so much magical knowledge to study every day, so I'm sorry, I can't agree to that. Dylan shook his head. Seeing that Professor McGonagall seemed ready to persuade him, he added, besides, I'm really not that interested in Quidditch. This statement directly blocked Professor McGonagall's intentions. Well, everyone has their own interests. You can't force them. Professor McGonagall nodded regretfully. After returning home that evening, Harry excitedly approached Dylan. Hey, Dylan, the Quidditch match is the day after tomorrow. You'll definitely come to see me then, right? Dylan hesitated for a moment. The anticipation flickering in Harry's eyes was like two spotlights, nearly blinding him. He rubbed his temples and nodded gently. I will, yeah. Harry jumped up excitedly. By the time the Quidditch match was about to begin, at 11 o'clock in the morning, almost the entire Hogwarts faculty and students had arrived. The stands were packed, a sea of people. The golden, white, and black heads intertwined, looking like mushrooms. Dylan rushed over from the library just in time. When he arrived at the seat Ron had reserved for him, he looked up and saw the banner held by Seamus and Ron. The banner was made of a dirty bed sheet with a few large words written in ink on it. Potter is the best. Yes, there were 3 exclamation marks at the end. Dylan looked at the dirty bed sheet swaying back and forth above his head, his whole body showing a shocked expression. He scratched his face lightly. What is this, waving flags to cheer? Ron said excitedly. Dylan looked at Hermione again. However, Hermione just waved her wand, causing the words on the bedsheet to gradually change color, becoming more and more bright and eye-catching. Dylan's eyes widened. Harry will definitely win. Chapter 48 Jinx. The lion has to be golden, Hermione. Seamus finished speaking, and Dylan couldn't help but look up at the other side of the banner. There was a painting of a lion that didn't quite resemble a lion. I drew this, an excited voice called out. Dylan glanced and saw it was Seamus's friend, Dean. Neville rubbed his head. I just happened to have a sheet I didn't want anymore. Did you provide the sheet? Dylan glanced back at the fat boy. When the latter nodded, he scratched his head with his wand. In that case, should I do something too? Neville blinked, but before he could say anything, Dylan's wand began to wave. Vira Verdo, particles of pink starlight shimmered, appearing even more dazzling and dreamy in the sunlight. The magic gradually seeped into the sheet. Suddenly, the entire sheet trembled violently. The next moment, the words, awakened by magic, suddenly took on physical form. They stood up, transforming into tiny, adorable cartoon characters, which hopped and danced across the sheets, their colors changing. Potter is the best, Potter is the best. These characters, dressed in brightly colored clothes, their faces beaming with vivid expressions as they roared in unison. Simultaneously, the hideous lion pattern on the sheets began to animate, its outline gradually becoming thicker and more vivid. Finally, it suddenly rose from the sheets, transforming into a majestic cartoon lion. Its sturdy build radiated a golden glow, its mane billowing like a blazing flame. The cartoon lion took off, circling the cheering characters, its head thrown back and unleashing a deafening roar. Ron, Neville, and the others watched with wide eyes and open mouths. Merlin's nose. It's so handsome. Hermione was a little surprised at Dylan's mastery of the transfiguration charm. This spell, which transformed words into physical form, even made them come alive, left Hermione stunned. Not only them, but many of the surrounding young wizards also cast astonished glances. Meanwhile, Madam Hooch, the referee, had arrived at the center of the field. The 2 teams had already entered. I want the game to be fair, which means you must be honest and not try to cheat. Beep, the sharp whistle echoed throughout the Quidditch pitch. Dozens of broomsticks quickly lifted off the ground. It had to be said that although Dylan hadn't been particularly enthusiastic about this kind of game, being there and feeling the passionate atmosphere stirred him to a level he hadn't felt in a long time. Suddenly, A deep voice reached Dylan's ears. "Excuse me." Dylan turned and saw a large figure. He looked up and realized it was Hagrid. Dylan's seat was already quite cramped, and when Hagrid arrived, the young wizards around him made room for him. 4 seats were now packed in. Hagrid smiled, his eyes fixed on the field, his head tilted towards Dylan. "That's some impressive magic. It seems you have a natural talent for spells." Dylan smiled politely. "Just some tricks, but I do have a talent, Hagrid. Greek letter upsilon, Greek letter upsilon." He smacked his lips, stroked his beard, and smiled, changing the subject to Ron. "The snitch hasn't appeared yet?" "The game had already started when I got here." "Not yet." Ron, also fascinated by Quidditch, kept his eyes fixed on the field, then shook his head at Hagrid. Dylan also focused on the game. Although he hadn't studied the rules of Quidditch in detail, based on the information he knew, he roughly understood that the golden snitch was crucial to winning the game. Without the snitch, the 2 players had no choice but to fight for the quaffle. However, watching the 2 players on the field, one vying for the quaffle while the other deliberately flinging it at the other, his mouth twitched slightly. It seemed that personal attacks were an essential tactic in any sport. Just then, exclamations erupted from the stands. Dylan immediately noticed a flash of golden light shooting out of the air. Harry and the Slytherin Seeker were sent flying simultaneously. Just as Harry was about to catch the snitch, another Slytherin player suddenly appeared from the side, knocking Harry far away and nearly knocking him off his broom. Dylan's eyes widened. "Hey, they're really mean," Ron shouted. "They committed a foul." Professor McGonagall's face changed. Hagrid glanced towards the opposite stands. Meanwhile, Madame Hooch had also flown into the air, giving the Slytherin a stern scolding. Gryffindor could still use another free kick for this, but the chance they had of ending the game with a golden snitch was clearly gone. "That kind of foul deserves a straight red card." Din's eyes widened. "This isn't football. Where does a red card come from?" Seamus shook his head. The Gryffindor wizards were furious, even Hermione. Dylan glanced around the field. He vaguely remembered someone attacking Harry during Quidditch. Is that Quirrell? As he pondered this, Dylan suddenly felt a faint, carefully concealed surge of magical energy. Ever since Dylan refined his wand attack effects, he'd noticed an increased sensitivity to the auras produced by various spells. Jinx. Dylan immediately recognized the nature of the spell. It was a rudimentary curse, laced with malicious intent. While it didn't inflict the same devastating and irreparable damage as some other dark arts spells, it could still occasionally bring minor misfortunes or even unfortunate events upon the victim. Obviously, if Harry, flying at high speed, were struck by the jinx, he would likely fall from the sky, colliding with walls or fences, breaking into pieces. Quirrell dared to attack, perhaps to test whether old Dumbledore was still in school. The jinx quickly took effect on Harry. Harry, flying steadily, suddenly collapsed, trembling and tumbling in the air. Something seemed to be amiss with his broom, carrying Harry along in a turbulent manner, before soaring high into the sky. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 49, Professor Quirrell vomited all over everyone. What's going on? Hermione's brow furrowed. Is that broomstick in disrepair? Hagrid frowned. No, only dark magic can affect a broomstick. What? Hermione was startled, and immediately snatched the telescope from Hagrid. She looked around and quickly locked onto someone casting a spell. Snape. He's casting a spell, huh? Ron's eyes widened. No, Professor Snape is crazy. He's trying to kill Harry at this moment. Hermione thrust the telescope in front of Ron's eyes. Look, then what should we do? Ron took the telescope and, sure enough, saw Professor Snape mumbling something incoherently. Of course we have to stop him. Hermione stood up and was about to dash around half the field to Snape. But then Dylan spoke up. Don't worry, look at what that is. He snatched the telescope from Ron's hand again, held it in front of Hermione, and adjusted it. Professor Lodge? He's actually casting a spell, too. Hermione was stunned. This professor who holds a textbook every day, stutters during class, and whose face looks like an old lady's eel the entire time, can actually cast a spell. Hermione was a little surprised. Dylan's eyes widened slightly, glancing at Hermione's rosy mouth, which was slightly open in shock. Such vicious words, coming from that mouth, Dylan pursed his lips. Anyway, Quirrell's lessons are like old ladies' foot wraps, smelly and long, but it's also true that he's casting a spell. Besides, a curse will cause Harry's broomstick to lose control, but a counter curse will also allow Harry to regain control. But it's strange that Quirrell can cast any spell, isn't it? Hermione frowned and nodded slightly. So what should we do? Don't panic. Dylan moved his wand. Although the distance was far, Dylan pointed his wand in Quirrell's direction. You're going to cast a spell from here on that side. Hermione turned around. Dylan smiled softly. Finite incantatem, he muttered the incantation. But actually, confundo, Dylan didn't dare use dark magic directly in this position, even if there was an overt spell to hide it. Because Quirrell was trying to test whether old Dumbledore was home, and he wanted to know. He wasn't sure if old Dumbledore had left the academy, let alone if he was watching Quirrell. Maybe he was already disguised as a student, sitting in a corner, sneaking around. Dylan didn't want to take that risk. It might have been okay in the dungeon, but besides directly witnessing him using dark magic, even using spells to observe his movements, there was no way to directly determine what spell he was using. With so many people around now, Dylan couldn't tell if old Dumbledore was hiding among them. Compared to Quirrell, he felt that if old Dumbledore really focused on him, then Harry might grow up to be fighting him, not Voldemort. Even before Harry grew up, old Dumbledore would probably strangle him right there. Just as Dylan cast a confusion charm, it sailed across nearly half the field and landed on Quirrell, who was battling Professor Snape. Just as he was about to throw another bewitching charm at Harry, he suddenly felt a pain in his head and a twitch in his mouth. He hurled a hex, poisonous curse, at himself. His stomach ached, his face suddenly turning pale. His eyes widened, his pupils constricted, and his lips trembled slightly, their colorless color almost dislocating. Then, Quirrell's throat convulsed violently, his mouth flaring open as if his jaw were about to dislocate. With a G, a stream of yellow-green vomit erupted uncontrollably from his mouth, fanning out in front of him. The semi-fluid puddle was mingled with soft bread crumbs, wisps of vegetable leaves, and a vague, indistinguishable paste. Like ammunition fired from a shotgun, it shot straight towards the crowd ahead. Before anyone in the front row could react, they were drenched by the sudden downpour. Some were splashed in the face and instinctively squeezed their eyes shut. Others, sprayed on themselves, jumped in terror. Still others opened their mouths in fear, watching Harry, who was losing control, in the air. And then, suddenly, as if on cue, many in the front row joined in the passionate chorus. The scene erupted in chaos. Quirrell, oblivious to the others, leaned forward uncontrollably, his hands on his knees, still retching. Professor Snape was about to cast another spell at Harry, but the curse on Harry had already dispelled it. Then, in the stands not far away, chaos erupted. He froze. Meanwhile, Hermione, who had been observing Quirrell through a telescope, quickly lowered it, covered her mouth with a hand, and looked at Dylan with a look of panic. "What's going on? What's going on over there?" Ron asked anxiously. Hermione, however, covered her mouth, her body twitching, unable to speak. "What the hell is going on?" Ron, anxious, snatched the telescope from Hermione's hand. He put it to his eyes and took a look. Professor Quirrell vomited all over them? Ugh, no, Dylan glared. Ron quickly shoved the telescope into Seamus's arms and covered his mouth tightly with both hands. Hermione took a long moment to recover. She opened her water glass, took 2 sips, and then looked at Dylan. Did you do this?" Dylan turned around and blinked innocently. "Hey. Don't blame me. I just used a stop spell. Besides, at this distance, maybe my spell didn't even reach them." This time, he didn't show any special effects of his attack. He wouldn't respond to any accusations of using any spell. Hermione looked at him suspiciously. He had just used a spell, but it had no special attack effect? Suspicious. But was it really Quirrell who was casting a curse on Harry? Hermione didn't dwell on it too much, instead looking towards the other side of the field. Chaos had broken out over there, with many young wizards screaming and swarming around. But soon, a professor stepped in to restore order. The game didn't end there, but the young wizards, centered around Quirrell and with the vomit as their radius, had completely lost interest in watching the game and left one after another, rushing back to their dormitories to shower, even though the professor had already cleaned them up. Chapter 50, Attacking the Professor Will Give You a Full-Level Spell? In Hagrid's cabin, Dylan sat on the sofa, stirring his hot tea. A fragrant aroma lingered at his nose, and Dylan sniffed gently. Snaggletooth nettle leaves, star silver. Harry sat on the other side, looking particularly strange. In the cup before him, the amber tea rippled slightly, and hot steam rose, tangling in the air and staining his mirror. Harry's gaze fixed on Hermione through the hazy heat. Are you saying that my broom went out of control because of Professor Quirrell's mischief, and Professor Snape was trying to save me? Hermione's face was serious. I understand what you mean, but Professor Snape was just a little harsh on us. He doesn't seem like the type to hide us. A little harsh, Ron gaped. Hermione gave him a helpless look, then cast her gaze on Dylan. What do you think, Dylan? Ron and Harry also looked at him. Dylan didn't rush to answer, but took a sip of Hagrid's hot tea. Hiss. A tingling sensation shot straight to his head. Dylan slowly closed his eyes, feeling as if he were drinking. However, thanks to the snake's fang nettle leaves, the intense stimulation on his tongue spread throughout his entire mouth, causing his lips to tremble slightly, as if countless tiny electric currents were dancing in his mouth. Why does Hagrid always like to mess around with such strange foods? Regaining his composure, he put down his teacup and nodded to Hermione. Professor Snape is a bit harsh, at least that's how I feel, and it was Professor Quirrell who was hexing you this time. Dylan's gaze fell on Harry. He wanted to bewitch you, but I think you all know what happened later. He vomited all over the little wizards. Speaking of this, Hermione and Ron both wore expressions of disgust. Harry frowned. Maybe Professor Snape was attacking me, and Professor Quirrell saved me. Just then, Hagrid approached, carrying a huge teapot. Professor Snape wouldn't hurt you, that's for sure. Harry stared at him for a moment. What does that mean? Hagrid faltered again, his eyes darting back and forth among the teacups of the young wizards. Seeing that Dylan's cup was almost empty, he hurried over, carrying the huge teapot, almost hitting Dylan on the head. Hey, Mr. Hagrid, Dylan's eyes widened. This was freshly brewed hot tea. Oh, God, look what I almost did. I'm so sorry. Hagrid hurriedly grabbed the handle of the teapot and was about to lean over to pour Dylan another cup. Dylan waved his hand gently. I'll just have my milk tea. Your tea makes me feel like drinking alcohol. With that, he waved his wand, and a stream of milk tea gushed out from the tip of the wand and landed in the cup. Wow, what new magic have you learned? Ron's eyes widened. I created it myself. Dylan took a sip of his carefully blended milk tea and closed his eyes comfortably. The young wizards around him were dumbfounded. Hagrid laughed. I heard Professor McGonagall say you're amazing. Pour me a cup too. Dylan naturally didn't refuse. The conversation among the young wizards shifted from his homemade spell to the restricted area on the 4th floor and the three-headed dog. If it's really Quirrell who wants to attack me, it's probably because I discovered the secret of that room. Harry frowned. The hot tea in his hand had been replaced with Dylan's milk tea. Hagrid turned his head. Are you talking about Fluffy, the three-headed dog? Harry looked at him. Yeah, I bought it from a Greek last year. And then Professor Dumbledore borrowed it from me to guard. Hagrid's mouth opened and closed, then quickly closed again when he realized something. At the same time, he couldn't help but glance at Dylan. Harry didn't notice Hagrid's action, but was stunned for a moment. Then he quickly stood up and questioned Hagrid. What? That three-headed dog? I mean, Fluffy, what is it guarding? Hagrid swallowed furiously. Dylan took another sip of his milk tea. This Hagrid, why is his mouth like the bottom of a sieve? Everything comes out. As Harry continued to question Hagrid, Hermione looked at Hagrid and then at Dylan with a bit of surprise. Finally, Hagrid's questioning became impatient. Angrily, he kicked them all out of the hut. Bang! The door slammed shut. Harry rubbed his nose. Is Hagrid mad at me? Dylan smiled. Maybe he's mad at himself. Harry had tricked him again. The three-headed dog was guarding something connected to Nick Flamel. Wasn't that a clear signal that the restricted area contained the Philosopher's Stone? It would be strange if they weren't angry. Hermione suddenly asked Dylan, do you already know what's in that room? Dylan nodded calmly. But as a conscientious young wizard, I promised Hagrid that I wouldn't tell anyone about this, unless I can master a certain unforgivable curse to the maximum level, but you know that's impossible, so don't even think about asking me. Dylan smiled. If you really want to know, then you should try to test Hagrid more often. His mouth is as loose as an old lady's cotton socks. He might accidentally tell you. Hermione sighed. How could you possibly master a certain unforgivable curse to the maximum level? That's a vicious oath you made. Dylan smiled but said nothing. On the way back to the castle, Hermione and Harry continued to discuss the object guarded by the three-headed dog. Dylan went straight back to the library. He had just found a seat and hadn't even opened a book when he noticed a notification pop up in the achievement system. Achievement: Attack the Professor. Description: You, the evil and vicious little wizard, have bravely taken the first step. You did a great job. Next time, why not try using the Unforgivable Curse on the Professor? Requirements to light up: Cast a curse on a professor at Hogwarts, causing negative consequences. Achievement reward: Full level beginner spell +1. Dylan looked at the achievement that was lit up this time, and the corners of his mouth twitched. During this period, no matter when he first arrived at a certain place in Hogwarts, or how many courses he completed, or how many books he studied and read, the achievement rewards he achieved were nothing more than galleons and magical affinity. Unexpectedly, this time he attacked Quirrell. He was rewarded with a full-level spell. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.